Perhaps you're unaware, yet at this very moment, your consciousness is engaged in selecting options you haven't consciously considered. Within moments, you'll sense yourself becoming comfortable with this content, deciding to remain, deciding to pay attention, deciding to unwind. However, beneath the surface in your cerebrum, that selection was completed well before conscious recognition arrived. Neural pathways activate, configurations emerge, and resolution develops quietly. It appears you maintain authority, though reality proves more peculiar. Cognition frequently initiates action initially, offering explanation subsequently, and this represents merely the start. At present, while your gaze travels along the display, your cognition silently completes missing information you cannot perceive. Each individual viewing this possesses a gap in their sight where the optic pathway exits the eye structure. A void sufficiently substantial that an incomplete item might disappear within it. Nevertheless, you never observe this opening. Instead, you perceive an uninterrupted reality. Your cerebrum automatically fills the void, functioning like an unseen editor, reconstructing a moment before you realize anything was absent. Even your perception of duration flexes and distorts. An instant of apprehension can extend a single second into eternity. An instant of happiness can allow complete hours to pass by in a gentle haze. And when that sense of having lived this before appears, when an experience feels strangely recognizable, it doesn't represent an entrance to a previous existence or an error in the matrix. It constitutes a minor malfunction in the cerebrum's identification mechanism, an incorrect indication that seems more authentic than recollection itself. Because what follows proves even more peculiar. Your feelings don't simply tint your cognitions. They genuinely modify what you perceive. Worry can deepen darkness and constrict your sight range. Tranquility can enhance the hues of existence until they radiate somewhat gentler. And underlying everything, your cerebrum forecasts what arrives next, approximately half a second before reality actually presents it. You aren't encountering unprocessed actuality. You're encountering your cerebrum's optimal estimation. A regulated vision that typically corresponds with facts, though not invariably. This evening, we'll explore these false perceptions. Selection occurring prior to recognition, duration that flexes, recollections that reconstruct themselves, feelings that mold observation, and the concealed mechanisms that maintain everything operating soundlessly. It may seem disconcerting initially, comprehending how extensively your reality is constructed backstage. However, by the conclusion, you'll grasp why these false perceptions manifest and why they aren't imperfections whatsoever, but rather sophisticated solutions engineered to assist you traverse a reality considerably more intricate than awareness independently could manage. Therefore, make yourself comfortable, allow your cognitions to relax somewhat, and permit the subtle enigma of your personal consciousness to emerge softly to awareness. And during our drift here, precisely at the threshold of all this peculiarity, this typically represents where I prefer to ease matters briefly. If explorations such as this tranquil, inquisitive, somewhat enigmatic assist your nights in becoming more peaceful, or your existence in feeling somewhat broader, I would genuinely appreciate if you'd contemplate subscribing. And if anything in this narrative connects with you, even for merely an instant, an approval or a remark assists additional individuals in discovering their path into this peaceful small realm we're constructing collectively. Absolutely no obligation, merely something mild if you happen to sense the inclination. Your appendage is already in motion. You're partially toward the entrance before the justification manifests. Or you've expressed pleasure at a comfortable, recognizable aroma. A pulse before the designation vanilla or aged literature registers an awareness. Emotion arrives initially. The explanation of purpose arrives subsequently. It seems understated, innocuous, nearly commonplace. And it proves so. Yet it also suggests something more substantial occurring underneath recognition. Awareness seems like the initiation point for cognition. We detect a want, evaluate alternatives, conclude, and subsequently proceed. However, the sequence frequently inverts. Neural mechanisms initiate beyond sight, accumulate intensity, and subsequently deliver the conclusion to awareness as though it functioned as the originator. Your recognition transforms into the ultimate phase of an extensive chain that commenced without your observation. It appears organized, productive, and somewhat deceptive because it maintains the disorder of transitional phases away from your cognitive workspace. Proof for this chain manifests when we examine closely a chronology. In traditional investigations, cerebral indications that predict a selection emerge before individuals acknowledge desiring to shift. The preparation signal develops multiple hundreds of milliseconds before a digit elevates, while the individual continues sensing they're deliberating it. Additional investigations extend that advanced duration even more with activation configurations in anterior and lateral regions, indicating an approaching resolution seconds before individuals claim they selected. The consciousness appears to organize in silence, subsequently engages recognition to provide narration. That postponement seems theoretical until you encounter it in everyday existence. A keyboard player's digits occasionally settle on the appropriate harmony without deliberate arrangement, particularly in a recognized sequence. A vehicle operator releases pressure from the speed control and shifts toward the stopping mechanism before the danger becomes completely acknowledged. A silhouette at the periphery of sight, an alteration in stopping indicators, a configuration that doesn't seem correct. In dialogue, you're already rotating toward a sound before you've identified who it belongs to. The physical form shifts on partial data, steered by mechanisms calibrated to configurations that recur. Those configurations originate from a cerebrum that forecasts continuously. It acquires the pace of footfalls on your stairway and anticipates the subsequent one. It projects the pattern of a phrase and arranges your answer before the final term arrives. It completes what probably occurs following the sound of glass or the sound of furniture. These projections operate simultaneously with arriving information, modifying when there's a discrepancy. The outcome is velocity responses that seem instant because the foundation was established just before the instant materialized. To coordinate all this, the cerebrum screens. The majority of what contacts your perception never transitions into recognition. Background sound diminishes into absence. Remote vehicles vanish, and the subtle electric hum disappears. The mechanism categorizes them as unimportant and preserves capacity for what holds significance. And yet the screen becomes permeable when it must be. Your designation penetrates through a crowded space. A shattering glass sound advances to priority position. The infrastructure underneath continues monitoring, prepared to elevate what holds significance. We label portions of this instinct, and it frequently appears like an enigmatic indication from elsewhere. However, it constitutes the product of concealed computation. Your cerebrum detects minor modifications in environment tension. Sounds lower slightly. Shoulders lower or elevate. Observation configurations alter. You register minute facial movements you cannot articulate subsequently. You detect an air current that indicates an unsealed entrance behind you. Everything channels through dedicated circuits that evaluate danger, possibility, and interpersonal significance. When sufficient minor indicators coordinate, you sense a visceral impulse. Proceed, pause, articulate, cease. Awareness obtains a conclusion without the supporting documentation. The concealed sequence also manifests in the chronology of volition. Certain research indicates the cerebrum's preparation indication may represent the gathering of neural fluctuation, developing toward a limit rather than a direct path from purpose to motion. When that accumulation exceeds a threshold, motion ensues. Individuals continue acknowledging the instant of selection. However, that chronological marker can alter. If you introduce a sound following a motion, acknowledged purpose shifts to correspond with the response. It appears as though the cerebrum retroactively completes the account of when you resolved, weaving the chain into a more fluid narrative. None of this eliminates authority. You can refuse. There exists a short interval to stop a prepared motion, particularly for elementary movements. That final instant cancellation holds significance in everyday existence. You initiate responding with a pointed remark, and something restrains it. Your appendage commences stepping from the edge, subsequently halts. Deliberate refusal functions like a protection mechanism over mechanisms that are rapid by construction. Reflect how this manifests in motion. Ambulation appears elementary. It isn't. Your physical form generates constant micro-modifications to preserve equilibrium, modifies pace magnitude to surface resistance, calculates appendage positioning over irregular borders, and maintains cranial position constant to stabilize the sight range. These modifications transpire through vertebral and hindbrain mechanisms that monitor deviation and refresh continuously. You don't describe joint orientation or muscle engagement. You simply shift, and the infrastructure manages the disorder of the reality beneath your appendages. The identical phenomenon occurs in dialogue. You coordinate your interruptions to the alternate individual's respiration. You replicate their velocity without cognition. You commence indicating during an interval to communicate rotation acquisition. Vocal stress variations, ascending sounds, descending expressions forecast the conclusion of a phrase, so you can enter without intersection. Your hearing mechanism anticipates phonemes based on situation, subsequently amends if a term violates anticipation. If the pattern of vocalization malfunctions, a postponement in a transmission, a delayed sound supply, you sense the pressure because projection is unsuccessful, and correction demands concentration. Screening maintains your stability here. Also, if your cerebrum elevated every micro-modification in stance and sound, you'd surpass capacity in moments. Instead, it condenses the moment into a controllable synopsis and exclusively marks deviations and unanticipated term, an abrupt quiet, a respiratory sound in the incorrect position. Those markers represent projection deviations. They necessitate refreshes. You register them because they signify your representation requires a correction. This explains why certain circumstances seem instantly incorrect. Access a space and the sound magnitude is inappropriate for a reading room photograph on the surface. Your consciousness reduces your sound without a regulation manual. Observe a subtle indication of pressure-rapid eyelid movement, contracted mandible, and you develop careful before you can express why. Detect citrus and you align fabric on a platform. The indicators are minor. However, they connect into acquired sequences. The sequences operate automatically. Velocity holds significance for protection. The cerebrum purchases velocity with estimation. It establishes probable futures, subsequently employs arriving information to acknowledge or modify. When the significance is elevated, this benefit becomes apparent. On a cycle, your hold contracts on fragments before you categorize the alteration in resistance. In a preparation area, your appendage withdraws from a container. The instant temperature elevates before the cognition that's excessively heated develops. These instants seem precise and apparent because the mechanism is calibrated for them and the response is transparent. You functioned in duration, however projection occasionally advances beyond itself. You incorrectly perceive a term that corresponds to the phrase and exclusively register when the subsequent term conflicts. You extend for your device at a vibration that didn't transpire because your cerebrum anticipated it. You advance to the opposite when someone shifts correctly because your representation executed a familiar configuration. Deviation represents the expensive velocity. The mechanism acknowledges minor errors to obstruct substantial postponements. Observe this manner. Recognition obtains a selected supply. It receives the summary, not the unprocessed supply. It assists with arrangement, trajectory amendment, and interpersonal discussion. However, it isn't generating every instruction. That function belongs to strata of infrastructure refined to preserve you existing and productive. If anything, the construction safeguards you. It protects you from disturbance and provides you a functional representation of reality, plus a mechanism to participate when it holds significance. There exists a reassurance in this. You don't require calculating each phase of a stairway, interpreting every micro-indicator of a companion's countenance, or deliberately regulating every respiration during a tense instant. Your cerebrum possesses those responsibilities. It maintains a silent observation, advances probable motions forward, and exclusively requests your contribution when the resolution, configuration branches in a significant manner, or when a prepared action ought to be terminated. This separation of responsibilities explains why you can maintain a cognition while preparing beverage, why you can operate vehicles and continue perceiving your designation in a melody, why you can maintain a juvenile and oscillate in pattern without ever enumerating. Nevertheless, there exists an inquiry that continues. If recognition arrives delayed to the occasion, what precisely is it observing? The material that achieves awareness has already been screened, projected, and woven into consistency. Hues are equilibrated against situation. Sounds are coordinated with oral structures. Motions are refined. Even the perception of when you resolved can be influenced by response. What you encounter as the current instant represents an assembled moment that conceals the modifications. That moment proves beneficial. It provides you constancy. It preserves you from the turbulence of unprocessed information. And because the mechanism operates on projections, your internal condition molds what you're delivered. Anticipate a companion, and you'll identify them more rapidly. Organize for a disagreement and impartial language seems pointed. Readiness isn't impartial. It flexes observation toward what it considers probable or significant. Therefore, the cerebrum functions before you do not to mislead you, however to assist you. It projects to preserve duration, screens to preserve capacity, and rehearses to diminish danger. It delivers you a synopsis and requests you to navigate when required. You obtain refusal authority, extended arrangement, and interpersonal subtlety. The infrastructure underneath manages the labor. If that's accurate, subsequently, the subsequent phase is apparent. If your resolutions, responses, and even your perception of chronology arrive pre-modified, what is recognition actually observing when it becomes alert to the instant? And if the supply it obtains is selected, how precisely does it correspond to reality exterior to your physical form? Extend your digit outward at appendage magnitude. That area your digit occupies is more compact than the void in your sight that you transport constantly. It resides where the visual pathway exits the eye structure, a vacancy that should disrupt every moment you observe. You never register it. The cerebrum completes it with whatever it anticipates should reside there: the surface of a barrier, the extension of a boundary, the remainder of a countenance so fluidly that the vacancy never materializes in recognition. This silent covering represents not an unusual technique. It constitutes routine. The consciousness does not pause for reality to deliver a finished representation. It completes the representation on your account. That's because the consciousness doesn't function like an optical device. It operates like a modifier on schedule. Arriving indications are disorderly and incomplete. The modifier projects what the subsequent image should comprise, refines the connections, and substitutes absent material with reasonable substance. Even before a vision contacts recognition, presumptions advance ahead of it. A silhouette is understood as dimension. A hue is modified by the illumination surrounding it. The reality you encounter represents not an unprocessed documentation. It constitutes an optimal estimation restoration, enhanced for velocity and practicality. This explains why dual individuals can position in the identical space and not entirely observe the identical location. Internal conditions alter the modifier's configurations. Worry contracts the concentration and obscures borders, attracting concentration toward possible dangers. Melancholy extracts richness from the moment, reducing distinction, so everything seems more remote. Happiness expands the investigation illumination, elevating precision and transporting additional particulars into perception. The exterior reality doesn't modify between observations. The internal adjustments do, and observation ensues. You can observe those adjustments functioning in false perceptions that convert elementary configurations into shifting moments. A matrix of motionless boundaries appears to oscillate. A vision constructed from motionless images vibrates with motion that doesn't exist. What's transpiring represents not visual structure malfunction, however, productive projection. The cerebrum anticipates motion along particular trajectories. Therefore, it supplements it. Hues decline to remain positioned also. A neutral rectangle appears more illuminated or obscured based on what encloses it, because hue constitutes a calculated indication, not an established characteristic. Position the identical shade against azure, subsequently against amber, and your encounter of it modifies. Even linear boundaries deceive you. Incline their adjacent elements, and the boundary appears to curve. The visual mechanism values connections more than fixed values, and that priority preserves you operational in intricate moments. However, abandons you accessible to refined techniques. You can also detect the mechanism weaving perceptions collectively. Observe a performer's figure vocalize while the artist vocalizes, and the language appears to originate from the figure's oral structure. Your cerebrum resolves the disagreement by designating sound to the more dependable indicator in that instant the shifting oral structures it can perceive. Postpone the sound while observing an individual vocalize and oral coordination disintegrates. Nevertheless, following a short interval, your cerebrum partially accommodates, altering understood chronology to diminish the inconsistency. The objective represents not flawless precision. It constitutes a singular consistent narrative. The modifier accepts minor deviations to preserve one fluid account. Even the action of observation is modified. Your visual structures advance multiple occasions each moment in rapid movements. During those advances, reality would become indistinct. You don't observe that indistinctness. The cerebrum suppresses or conceals the contribution during the shift and weaves the preceding and subsequent into an uninterrupted moment. You encounter a constant space, a comprehensible document, a constant boundary, while underneath the detector is advancing around. The mechanism conceals the framework, so the completed vision seems motionless. The identical chronology complications can generate an instant scene peculiarly recognizable. That sensation of repetition represents not communication from elsewhere. It constitutes a short disturbance in the coordination between identification mechanisms. A sensation of recognition arrives before the situation that typically accompanies it. Therefore, the current moment receives categorization as recollected. The outcome represents an incorrect designation of previously observed applied to a novel occurrence. It constitutes a notification that observation relies on chronology as extensively as substance. When indications materialize beyond sequence, encounter reorganizes surrounding the malfunction. Underlying everything operates a projecting mechanism. The consciousness doesn't pause for reality. It extends a portion of a moment forward, subsequently examines arriving information against that projection. When the projection corresponds, you sense reality is constant and uninterrupted. When it malfunctions significantly, when an individual you didn't anticipate advances into perception, when a sound emerges in silence, the projection is refreshed and concentration reorients. The majority of duration, this interaction is imperceptible. You register it exclusively at the peripheries, when a false perception exposes a shortcut or a surprise necessitates a restoration. Reflect about how extensively matters must function correctly for an elementary moment to seem commonplace. Illumination contacts the eye structure. Indications traverse the visual pathway. Characteristics are obtained. Motion is deduced. Borders are identified. Hues are calculated relative to encompassing illumination. Dimension is approximated from difference. And everything is combined with anticipations about what typically resides in locations similar to this. Subsequently, chronology is established. The advances of the visual structures are concealed and sound is coordinated with motion. The result achieves recognition as a singular current instant that seems direct and apparent. The exertion continues beyond perception. Situation flexes even fundamental measurements. Position dual identical items against different surroundings, and their magnitudes appear dissimilar. Position an item at the boundary, and it appears more substantial than the identical item elevated, because the mechanism presumes boundary items are more remote. Illumination intensity modifies according to encompassing radiance. Therefore, a plane in silhouette can be understood as more illuminated than an identically tinted plane in brilliance. None of this represents negligence. It constitutes the cerebrum preferring beneficial understandings that typically monitor the configuration of reality. Comparative illumination indicates planes. Surrounding surface indicates remoteness. And uniform motion indicates a singular shifting item. When detectors disagree, the cerebrum resolves the controversy by prioritizing whichever indication possesses the most reliable performance documentation in that situation. Sound positioning receives attraction toward visual indicators because visual structures typically identify position more accurately. Chronology assessments receive modification to correspond the pattern of anticipated origins and consequences. Even the perception of contact can be misled when sight proposes a different origin. The account you encounter represents the discussed resolution among disorderly contributions steered by previous understanding and current objectives. That discussion transpires rapidly enough that recognition materializes delayed to the mechanism. By the duration you observe, the modifier has already completed, screened, and coordinated. If the cerebrum encounters an unfamiliar configuration, it examines several understandings and establishes on the one that produces consistent motion. You register uncertainty exclusively when understandings exchange backward and forward, similar to the countenance container vision, alternating between dual interpretations. The majority of duration, the initial functional estimation maintains and encounter proceeds because the mechanism is perpetually projecting. You can sense the outcome as a minor comfort when reality operates as anticipated and a short disruption when it doesn't. Advance into obscured space, and your consciousness preloads what an obscured space typically comprises. Perceive footfalls behind you, and your cerebrum projects velocity and trajectory to assist determining if you should rotate. These projections reduce thousandths of moments from response duration and diminish the computational burden on the deliberate workspace. The expense represents occasional deviation when the projection is incorrect. Feelings calibrate the projection. A concerned cerebrum anticipates danger at the peripheries and distributes concentration accordingly, magnifying distinctions and constricting the range. A tranquil cerebrum anticipates protection and expands the optical device, permitting additional peripheral particulars to emerge. That's why one individual registers every minor motion on a silent pathway, while another registers the comfort of the illumination. Both are observing an assembled moment steered by different internal configurations. The more you investigate these assemblies, the more transparent the configuration becomes. The cerebrum preserves you vertical in a disorderly sensory turbulence by demanding consistency. It eliminates the vacant area, connects sounds to oral structures, refines visual structure advances, and establishes the current. It estimates what belongs where and completes with reasonable substance when the information are minimal. The reality you encounter is limited by actuality. however constructed by your nervous mechanism's discussed representation of it. With unusual situations, this representation assists you adequately. It provides you nourishment, preserves you protected, and permits you to interpret countenances and identify entrances. Register how this structure modifies what observing accuracy signifies. There exists no unprocessed supply awaiting to be obtained. No concealed channel that delivers unmodified actuality. There exists a beneficial assembly that dependably monitors the surroundings and modifies continuously. It is precise enough to steer motion and adaptable enough to amend itself when projections disintegrate. It can be influenced by disposition and situation, and it can be misled by sophisticated configurations. However, those represent the exchanges of a mechanism enhanced for velocity and continuation. Therefore, observation is optimally comprehended as a regulated vision steered by indications from exterior, limited by natural laws, however assembled interior according to the cerebrum's optimal representations and priorities. Dual individuals can observe at the identical atmosphere and possess different encounters, not because the atmosphere modified, however, because their representations and priorities vary. What you sense as the substantial present represents the result of a constant dialogue between anticipation and proof. If the reality you observe is assembled instant by instant, subsequently, the progression that weaves those instants collectively must be assembled also. The cerebrum not exclusively constructs moments, it constructs the perception of transition between them, which elevates a silent inquiry that will transport us more distant in. How does this mechanism manage the extension and compression of duration within the actuality it assembles? And what generates an instant seem extended, short, or peculiarly recognizable when everything in the space remains the identical? You recognize that abrupt descent in your abdomen when a vehicle deviates in your pathway? The manner reality contracts as though someone reduced the intensity on everything except your cardiac rhythm. The chronological device extending interior your cranium, while the exterior reality preserves its velocity. In that interval, sound appears to withdraw. Your respiration develops audible. Each cardiac beat focuses into precision like individual images in a cinematographic sequence. And a moment seems loaded with additional occurrences, and a duration typically maintains. You didn't select that distortion. It materialized as an involuntary response. The consciousness altered mechanisms and chronology modified with it. Chronology interior, the consciousness doesn't operate on the chronological device you transport. It flexes with feeling, concentration, and the quantity of particulars your cerebrum determines to accumulate. When reality seems energized, your perceptions commence documenting additional information coordinates per instant. Your recognition obtains additional captures, and those captures compress into recollection as concentrated strata. Subsequently, when you retrieve the occurrence, you interpret that concentration as magnitude. It seems more extended, not because additional moments transpired, however, because additional was documented and preserved. The contrary seems equally authentic. You position with a companion, receive attraction into a subject, and 3 durations, separate away in what appears like 20 periods. Or you descend into a pastime, and the surrounding disturbance of reality becomes silent. Your consciousness reduces the moment to what holds significance for the responsibility. Reduced captures receive documentation. Therefore, the documentation that receives establishment is more lightweight, more minimal. When you reflect backward, it condenses. Chronology didn't accelerate on the surface chronological device. However, your cerebrum composed a more compact account for that interval. Innovation executes an elementary technique with a profound consequence. Novel encounters request additional from your concentration. Therefore, you accumulate additional particulars. That's why initial years seem expansive. Initial localities, initial companions, initial warm seasons. Each period requiring a complete examination. As sequences establish in, Periods recur, and the cerebrum discontinues expending valuable resources on what it already projects. Intervals arrange, configurations assume control, and the documentation becomes minimal. Without innovation, chronology collapses into reduced recollectible indicators. An indistinctness established not by velocity, however, by recurrence. In the surroundings, a minor observant mechanism categorizes instants with importance. During danger or concentrated feeling, that mechanism transmits a wave of indications that elevate responsiveness. Sight refines and constricts. Audition calibrates to the most applicable wavelengths. Physical structures organize. The consciousness commences sampling more intensively, and that elevated sampling proportion establishes a more substantial indication. Subsequently, the instant reproduces in decelerated sequence because your recollection preserved additional images per moment than typical. The occurrence didn't extend. Your documentation of it developed more substantial. There exists another distortion at the connections of chronology that manifests as that sensation of repetition. The perception of recognition materializes before the origin of that sensation does. Identification activates excessively initially. Therefore, the current receives categorization as recollected even though you cannot connect it to a particular history. It seems peculiar because your chronological sequence is moderately beyond arrangement for a cardiac beat. The categorization manifests before the receptacle. It resolves nearly as rapidly as it manifests. However, the peculiarity continues as a notification that your mechanisms for monitoring present and past coordinate with precise chronology, and occasionally they misalign. Internal conditions also distort your perception of magnitude. Worry calibrates upward your internal rhythm device, accumulating periods with additional verifications and additional examinations. Each moment maintains supplementary observation, so importance emerges and chronology seems accumulated. Melancholy can level that pattern, diminishing distinction between instants until a period seems consistent and excessively extended. It's not exclusively disposition. It's the proportion at which your consciousness samples and evaluates. The chronological device hasn't modified. The concentration of internal occurrences has. Disinterest possesses its particular surface. When nothing attracts you, concentration transfers onto the transition of chronology itself. You initiate enumerating not quantities, however perceptions. The visual closure, the restless motion, the respiratory sound, the movement from the corridor. The consciousness maintains inquiring. Has anything modified presently? That observation extends the instant because you're calculating it in progressively minor components. Profound concentration executes the contrary. When all capacity channels into a singular responsibility, the mechanism disregards the progression of moments. It discontinues examining the chronological device interior to you, which explains why extended intervals can vanish without abandoning substantial indication. Rehearsal modifies this correspondence also. When you acquire a novel capacity, durations seem complete and extended because your cerebrum is constructing a substantial representation. Deviations, amendments, response, advancement. Once you mechanize the phases, your consciousness permits the sequence operate without documenting each shift. The recollection transforms into a minimal configuration. Traveling the identical trajectory, each period demonstrates the consequence. The initial several journeys establish indicators. Following the duration, the journey vanishes from your internal documentation, and you materialize with scarcely anything preserved between initiation and termination. Even minor modifications can decelerate observation. Selecting an unfamiliar trajectory, registering novel construction, attending for surfaces in a musical composition you presumed you comprehended. These actions attract concentration backward into sampling configuration. Reality develops particularized, and your perception of chronology expands with that particularity. You can sense this consequence when relocating. Periods extend not because they are more extended. However, Because every entrance mechanism, every pathway intersection, every sound requests computation. Those novel indicators multiply the captures. Apprehension constricts the range, however, elevates specificity within it. Happiness frequently expands it, permitting additional of the moment to access recognition, even if each component is less particularized. Both conditions modify the sensed magnitude of intervals. In one, moments are substantial and pointed. In the alternative, they are broad and gentle. The substance of the instant holds significance less than the manner. Your nervous mechanism distributes its capacities, where concentration establishes what it incorporates, how extensively it documents. These selections mold your internal chronological sequence. You can examine certain of these consequences during elementary responsibilities. Enumerate to 60 with visual structure sealed and no indicators. Your approximation will alter based on stimulation. If you've consumed stimulant or you're anticipating a communication, your duration tends to materialize initially because your internal chronological device functions rapidly. If you're tranquil and unwound, your duration can transfer extensively. Monotonous responsibilities seem extended because you maintain examining. Attracting responsibilities seem short because you discontinue observation. These represent not peculiarities. They represent indications of how concentration coordinates restricted capacity. Recollections obtain their evident magnitude during retrieval, not during the occurrence itself. The cerebrum reconstructs from preserved portions, and the quantity of portions holds significance. A singular precise instant can seem extended if it comprises numerous separate components. A complete interval can seem short if the consciousness documented exclusively several extensive configurations. The more your perceptions are engaged, the more substantial the indication. The more substantial the indication, the more extended the recollected chronology seems. This explains why sensory particular sounds, surfaces, aromas gently expand a recollection accessible when you return to it. Certain encounters eliminate chronology by diminishing self-observation. When difficulty corresponds capacity, you navigate the threshold with comfort. The mechanism silences any mechanism that isn't required for the responsibility. The discussion about how your functioning transfers disconnected. Without that account, your internal chronological maintainer remains inactive. You return to yourself subsequently and discover that the chronological device shifted while you were absent. It didn't advance. You simply discontinued calculating. Sequences can be reconstructed to retrieve magnitude. Modify initiation coordinates. Modify the arrangement of phases. Acquire a novel trajectory on a recognizable ambulation. Disrupt configurations that your cerebrum has established to automatic operation. Even minor innovation reintroduces concentration and decelerates the sense transition. If you desire periods to seem more extended, supplement initiations. A novel preparation, a capacity, a novel observation position in the identical space. Your consciousness will respond with additional sampling, and the documentation of the period will intensify. On the alternative aspect, if you require gentleness, diminish the quantity of contributions competing for recognition. Individual responsibility. Lower notifications. Permit concentration to descend into one channel at a duration. You'll probably discover that chronology condenses. However, the encounter seems more refined and less irregular. This doesn't represent an assertion for one configuration over the alternative, exclusively a method to observe how you participate in molding your perception of magnitude by steering what the consciousness observes. These alterations manifest even in silent hours. A short ambulation at twilight can seem extended if you attend for remote sounds. Register minor modifications in temperature between illuminated and silhouetted phases, or monitor the pattern of your velocity. The identical ambulation can seem compact if your consciousness navigates a singular cognition. Neither is incorrect. Both represent assemblies. The moment exterior remains the identical, while the interior sampling proportion elevates or descends. When pressure develops, your interior chronological device frequently accelerates. Responsibilities accumulate and your concentration fragments across them. Each micro-alteration generates additional verifications, additional enumeration. The period seems urgent and extended, yet nothing appears to adhere in recollection because the documentation is dispersed. Tranquility permits the contrary. Reduced alterations, more refined concentration, a more restricted account. The period may seem more compact, however, retrieval establishes a consistent configuration. Therefore, chronology interior, the consciousness represents not something you traverse through. It's something you assemble component by component from the fragments concentration selects and feeling emphasizes. The chronological device on the surface indicates equivalent components. However, the cerebrum indicates dissimilar ones, extending and condensing according to requirement, attraction, and condition. What seems extended or compact materializes from the concentration and arrangement of your perceptions, not from the moment indicator. If chronology seems adaptable, it's because you generated that matter, predominantly without registering. You alter the sampling proportion by how you concentrate. You modify the structure magnitude by what you value. You modify the chronological sequence by pursuing innovation or establishing into sequence. And every modification abandons an indication you will subsequently designate a recollection, which transports to the subsequent phase. Because the instants that seem extended, the ones that vanish, don't exclusively transition. They transform into the unprocessed substances your consciousness will employ this night and the following period to maintain, communicating you who you constitute and what your existence has represented. You indicate along, detecting the pattern of a narrative, and subsequently it contacts you. You haven't perceived the final several phrases whatsoever, or your visual structures transfer downward a document, while your consciousness assumes a lateral journey. And when you observe backward, the language seems like traces you never generated. It seems peculiar, somewhat uncomfortable. Similar to concentration, departed out the posterior entrance without communicating you. However, that instant doesn't represent a malfunction. It constitutes an indicator to how concentration actually operates. We prefer to conceptualize concentration as a transparent projection we direct at reality. In application, it oscillates. It contracts and releases. It restores repeatedly, frequently, without your approval. The component of your cerebrum that manages this coordination remains occupied even when you sense motionless distributing capacities, supervising interruptions, and determining what receives to advance forward. That constant reconstruction preserves you from being surpassed. However, it also signifies your encounter materializes in vibrations, not an uninterrupted channel. The majority of what encloses you never achieves through. The background sound underneath the platform diminishes. Vehicles combine into a singular mixture. Nevertheless, a singular gloss sound can attract you backward, precise and instant. The mechanism executes this to safeguard capacity. It screens initially, subsequently delivers the emphasis. You don't perceive this space as complete sound recording unless something in it modifies significance. Subsequently, the entrance expands. Plural responsibility processing seems like a sophisticated alternative. You respond to communication while agitating a receptacle. Subsequently comprehend you elevated the implement and positioned nothing in. You advance between applications and return to a dialogue with the filament disconnected. You attempt to interpret and document while pursuing language and discover you maintained both, however comprehended neither. Separating concentration represents less like fragmenting a projection and more like rotating it disconnected and activated and disconnected repeatedly in rapid sequences. Each restoration expenses you. Those expenses don't vanish when you alter backward. A remainder adheres to the consciousness, a variety of subsequent vision from the final responsibility. You can sense it when you return to composing following examining a communication, and the configuration you are constructing dissolves. The cerebrum requires a pulse to reorient to the previous objective, reconstruct the configuration and operational recollection, and re-access the identical cognitive channel. Until that reconstruction completes, cognition seems uncertain. You can detect this postponement in minor manners. You alternate backward to a calculation document and observe at the location you intended to modify. However, your appendages hesitate. You reopen a formula and reinterpret the identical configuration twice. You advance backward into an assembly, following a rapid observation at your schedule, and misplace the filament of why a resolution held significance. It doesn't represent inactivity. It's the manner responsibility alteration restores situation. When concentration constricts, it transforms precise. In an accumulated space, you can maintain one sound in the center and permit everything alternative become indistinct. Subsequently, you perceive your designation from across the space, and your concentration rotates like a detection apparatus, abruptly coordinated with a remote indication. You didn't select to examine for your designation, however component of you executed regardless, analyzing the disturbance for applicability behind the moments. The identical mechanism that disregards a dozen dialogues can focus to one that holds significance in a cardiac beat. That focus communicates you something significant. The consciousness is perpetually attending the low recognition. It separates, categorizes, and maintains a silent observation for indicators that may necessitate an alteration in concentration. When an indicator contacts your designation, an abrupt modification in sound, a term connected to an objective, the entrance expands and resources flood in. This generates concentration seen deliberate on the plane and automatic underneath. Both strata operate collectively, whether you register them or not. Occasionally, the mechanism's accuracy possesses an expense. When concentration secures onto a responsibility, the remainder of the moment can descend out. You can overlook a radiant indication while enumerating phases, malfunction to observe a companion gesturing while you examine for your instruments, or ambulate past the item you materialize to acquire because you're rehearsing an electronic communication in your cranium. If concentration doesn't select something, it may similarly not manifest. That seems peculiar, however it's uniform. Awareness obtains what concentration permits through. This selection can be startling. You can observe a minor assembly transfer a sphere and monitor every transaction, nevertheless malfunction to register someone ambulate directly through. The moment if your direction prioritizes the transfers, that doesn't represent a moral malfunction or negligence. It's the cerebrum executing prioritization. It selects the responsibility and releases anything that endangers execution, incorporating apparent matters, until the objective is finished. Selection of responsibility holds significance more than you conceptualize. Elementary sequences that coordinate with your current objective advance through comfortably. Difficult responsibilities with uncertain phases necessitate concentration to restore. Frequently, if the objective maintains shifting alternate between electronic communication, a composition, a dialogue, a schedule, the consciousness gathers remainder more rapidly than it eliminates it. That explains why the period can seem occupied, however minimal, similar to you shifted substantially and advanced nowhere. There exists an alternative configuration, though, when the responsibility corresponds your capacity and the response channel is transparent. Concentration can establish. Musical performers sense it when a section ultimately secures in. Programmers sense it when a challenge produces and configurations coordinate. Individuals who construct, illustrate, segment vegetation, or refine material descend into it as the appendages assume a pattern and the consciousness establishes. Self-observation diminishes. You discontinue examining how you're executing and simply execute. In that condition, chronology releases, periods condense. The internal narrator develops silent. You aren't attempting to concentrate because there's nothing remaining to select. The mechanism that typically oscillates identifies a channel and remains there, which represents unusual and gratifying. It doesn't represent enchantment. It's what transpires when the cerebrum doesn't possess to maintain reconfiguring for novel requirements. Diminished alteration liberates capacities to intensify the labor at hand. You can request this constancy without necessitating it. Reduce the quantity of accessible responsibilities. Establish a minor transparent objective with a perceptible completion. Permit the space be somewhat less disorderly. Not silent, exclusively uncomplicated. Permit an indicator that signifies presently we initiate. A particular seat, a particular melody, the initial consumption of infusion. These indications diminish the discussion your cerebrum would alternatively execute at the limit, generating it more comfortable to access and more difficult to descend out. However, flawlessness doesn't represent the objective. Concentration will continue oscillating. That oscillation represents a component of how the mechanism preserves you protected. It examines the peripheries for modification, observes for dangers or possibilities, and returns to the center if nothing important manifests. The more pressure you position on it to be uninterrupted, the more it pressures. Address it similar to a physical structure, and it opposes. Address it similar to a pattern, and it accommodates. You can sense this in everyday patterns. When you position the device across the space before a transmission, you're not demonstrating determination as extensively as reconstructing the surroundings, so the supervisors possess reduced attractive alternatives to evaluate. When you interpret before rest, instead of examining, you eliminate rapid novel indicators that would maintain concentration activating. Even minor modifications can permit the mechanism establish and recuperate. Natural surroundings assists for a connected justification. Surroundings with gentle configurations and soft modification request less from the regulation mechanisms while continuing maintaining attraction. The visual structures can transfer from component to component without pointed advances in requirement. You are not necessitated to determine every moment what holds significance. That more silent configuration restores capacity, which explains why a short ambulation can generate a duration of labor operate more refined. Concentration molds recollection. When you separate concentration, reduced particulars achieve into the documentation. You may transport the synopsis, however misplaced surface. If you provide an instant your complete observation, it establishes more reliably and returns with additional dimension. This represents not moral direction, it's mechanics. The cerebrum can encode substantially when capacities accumulate in one position, and it encodes minimally when the projection maintains restoring. It also signifies that disruptions don't exclusively extract chronology, they modify what you preserve. A dialogue interrupted by notifications produces portions. A consumption consumed while examining communications transforms into an indistinctness, comfortable to disregard. A responsibility completed without interruptions establishes out in retrieval, not because it was more significant, however, because concentration maintained, it's sufficiently extended to establish a transparent indication. The silent champion here represents operational recollection, the composition platform that maintains what you're executing presently. It's compact, it obscures comfortably. Every alteration eliminates the platform. Safeguarding it doesn't represent about separation from reality. It represents about considerate chronology. Consolidate minor interruptions collectively and eliminate them at once. Abandon yourself a notation that indicates where to re-access a responsibility. These minor supports diminish the expense of departing and returning. There exists a peculiar consideration in acknowledging the restrictions. When you sense your consciousness advance off a document, shift your visual structures away for an instant and permit the mechanism restore deliberately. When a companion vocalizes and you transfer, possess it rapidly and request them to recur the final configuration. That sincerity reduces the concealed burden of simulating, which liberates concentration to materialize backward more powerfully. In the conclusion, concentration represents not inadequate. It's responsive and accurate. It coordinates impossible magnitudes of information by selecting nearly nothing and executing it adequately, subsequently altering when reality necessitates it. It preserves you from submerging in disturbance, even when that signifies you occasionally overlook the apparent. It also provides you the optimal instance of effortlessness when situations coordinate, and it can rest interior a singular matter, and that transports us forward. If concentration determines what accesses recognition, subsequently what you preserve relies on a different mechanism completely. The consciousness doesn't document instants similar to photographs. It reconstructs them, modifies them, and occasionally generates components that generate the narrative operate. You're maintaining an ancient photograph, observing at countenances that haven't modified in years, while your personal consciousness silently modifies the moment. You recollect a humorous remark communicated precisely following the closure mechanism activated, an eruption of amusement that isn't documented, a current that transported a suggestion of precipitation in the manner your thorax seemed gentle for no transparent justification. None of that manifests in the vision, and nevertheless the recollection seems complete. It reproduces like a short cinematographic sequence with sound, temperature, and significance. Subsequently, uncertainty advances in. Did that humorous remark transpire in a different instant adjacent? Was the precipitation actually previous interval? Nevertheless, your consciousness delivers a finished encounter, consistent and definite. We're instructed to conceptualize recollection like preservation, a position where information received documentation. However, it operates more similar to a narrator that reconstructs the history each occasion you access it. The narrative employs portions, perceptions, feelings, fragments of situation, and weaves them collectively into an account that corresponds who you constitute presently. Because it's attempting to be beneficial, it completes gaps, so the history generates logic. That mechanism preserves existence sensing constant even as particulars alter. The reconstruction can supplement the expression that wasn't there, or refine a disagreement that at the duration seemed more pointed. The objective doesn't represent precision. The objective represents continuity, practicality, and a self that remains preserved from one period to the subsequent. Here represents the peculiar component. Retrieving a recollection doesn't exclusively extract it from a platform. The action of recollecting releases its filaments. When you transport a recollection into the current, it transforms accessible to modification. Your current disposition, what you've recently acquired, even the space's character can advance into it. Subsequently, when you discontinue cognizing about it, the consciousness preserves a modified version. Over years, recurrent retrievals can gradually incline the narrative, one recollection depending on another until a moderately different history seems natural. This doesn't represent malfunction. It constitutes an adaptable construction that permits the consciousness refresh instructions without possessing to re-encounter the original occurrence. Feeling instructs the cerebrum what to preserve. Concentrated instants receive categorization for priority. That's why juvenile discomfort can continue affecting multiple decades subsequently, while previous intervals' consumption has already dissolved. The mechanism categorizes by applicability to continuation and identification. A pointed apprehension, a radiant happiness, a profound sorrow. Those obtain supplementary concentration, and their indications distribute into numerous networks. Impartial sequences diminish because they transport minimal guidance for the future. When existence seems recurrent, it's not that nothing transpired. It's that the narrator identified minimal value retelling. Incomplete matters also decline to advance aside. Responsibilities you intended to finish in dialogues that concluded partially maintain indicating in the surroundings. The consciousness maintains them similar to accessible channels. A modest pressure that preserves them reachable. That's why an undelivered communication resurfaces at peculiar durations, or a partially executed assignment emerges into consciousness when you're attempting to unwind. The mechanism isn't insisting for its personal interest. It employs that pressure to safeguard your future objectives. Exclusively when you complete the channel or determine transparently to relinquish it, does that attraction comfort and the consciousness alter the item into reduced priority. Recollection and visualization distribute a workshop. They employ intersecting circuits, which generates retrieval. Vivid, however, also abandons it accessible to generation. Cognizing about a moment you never existed can acquire surfaces from moments you did. Propositions, suggestions, and even a wandering remark can steer what receives completed into the narrative. Over duration, a particular you supplemented as a visitor can establish in and seem as authentic as anything alternative. Not because you're negligent or insincere, however, because the mechanism directs toward a finished account. A finished account occasionally requires to deliver absent components so the consciousness can advance forward without ambiguity. This intersection assists clarify why a singular stimulus can transport in complete duration, accelerating backward. Aroma particularly possesses a direct pathway to more ancient emotional circuits. One suggestion of a particular cleansing substance or a spice from a pathway location, and you're there. The space arrangement, the illumination on the plane, the individual in the subsequent seat. It materializes with a sensation condition attached, as though the physical form recollected initially and delivered the instant upward to cognition. You didn't attempt to retrieve it. The recollection employed you to resurface, transporting hue, temperature, and stance. That's the mechanism at its most incorporated. Recollection as a complete physical form resonance rather than a catalog of information. Not all particulars compete equivalently for area. The initial and final instance of an occurrence hold more powerfully than the intermediate. Initiations establish the character. Conclusions determine how it will be documented: agreeable, incomplete, or instructive. We construct our synopses surrounding those borders without comprehending it, which explains why the final periods of a journey can restore a difficult interval, or an unpleasant departure can contaminate a period that was predominantly acceptable. The narrator evaluates transitions substantially because they indicate significance and project what similar instance may necessitate in the future. Melody can expand concealed entrances several segments of a composition, and your stance alters as though a harmony attracted you backward to a particular space or pathway. Pattern recruits motion and hearing regions, connecting movement with perception and disposition. That combination generates the recollection indication broad, so it's more comfortable to identify subsequently. Even when alternative trajectories diminish, a melody can continue directing the manner. Language delivers expression, pattern delivers chronology, and the physical form delivers the sensation. The instant returns not as a photograph, however as a moment you can nearly advance into. The reality that disregarding transpires represents not an imperfection. You require it. Releasing assists the consciousness universalize. If every particular remained, novel acquisition would receive trapped in the accumulation. Disregarding eliminates ancient components, so novel ones can develop. It also preserves you from transforming trapped by antiquated instructions. A technique that operated years previously may malfunction presently. An individual you evaluated incorrectly may presently be protected. When the mechanism releases unimportant indications, it liberates concentration for what holds significance presently. That also represents a variety of intelligence, the modesty to eliminate what no longer assists. Reflect how comfortably current condition modifies the history without your authorization. If you sense diminished, the consciousness extracts recollections that correspond, as though examining for verification. On more radiant periods, the identical occurrences appear equilibrated or even humorous. The circumstances didn't modify. However, the narrator selected different structures. That's because recollection assists the requirements of the instant as extensively as those of history. It inquires, who are you attempting to constitute presently? And which history will reinforce that? With every retrieval, it responds by selecting, accentuating, and reducing. This doesn't signify the history is misplaced. It signifies the history is animated. If you deliberately access a recollection with novel understanding or consideration, you can incline how it steers you. Positioning with it, while your physical form is more tranquil, modifies which characteristics establish out. Composing it downward can secure particulars that would alternatively alter on the subsequent retrieval. Coordinating it with a novel indicator, similar to a different aroma or a constant pattern, provides your consciousness another trajectory in and can refine the ancient emotional intensity. The reconstruction continues transpiring. However, presently it depends toward advancement. Incorrect recollections seem disconcerting. Nevertheless, they disclose how the consciousness strives for consistency. When confronted with voids, it completes them in reasonable manners. Over the extended progression of an existence, this capacity preserves your account consolidated. You recognize who you constitute, what you appreciate, and how you materialized here. Even if particular particulars oscillate, the expense of that internal constancy represents occasional imprecision. However, the advantage represents an identification that can modify without fragmenting. If you require accuracy for significant instants, you can reinforce the mechanism, compose simultaneous notations, examine exterior documentation, accumulate plural observations. Alternative, permitting the account respire enables adaptability. There exists another silent regulation. The physical form recollects in its personal expression. A contracted respiratory passage, a comfortable thorax, an agitated appendage. These perceptions transport fragments of encounter that language can overlook. When you retrieve something difficult, the physical form may respond initially. That response constitutes a configuration of recollection. And if you encounter it with constant concentration, you can frequently modify the instruction it delivers. Decelerated respiration, protected association, and established stance can instruct the mechanism a novel conclusion. The subsequent occasion that recollection emerges, it can materialize with reduced intensity. Not because the information have modified, however, because the physical form acquired a different manner to maintain them. There exist functional manners to operate with a consciousness that modifies complete channels instead of permitting them resonate in the surroundings. Establish transparent conclusion coordinates for assignments and dialogues so the mechanism can release its hold. Employ initiations and conclusions to your benefit. Initiate with purpose. Complete with consideration. When you desire to preserve a recollection precise, document it rapidly in elementary expression and in situation. When you desire to reconstruct how a recollection steers you, transport it upward gently in a condition of tranquility and permit a more intelligent current self execute the modification. Over duration, these selections gather into the version of you that your consciousness rehearses and retrieves. Therefore, recollection doesn't represent a platform of preserved instants. It constitutes an animated workshop, arranging moments to reinforce the following period's selections. Each retrieval represents an invitation to refine who you are transforming, whether by refining a difficult border, reinforcing a beneficial instruction, or releasing a moment that no longer corresponds. The self that emerges from this mechanism remains adaptable, more responsive than inflexible, more acquiring than established. And because the narrator never operates independently, the subsequent stratum pauses adjacent. The sensations that establish the foundation for what the consciousness registers, preserves, and modifies from instant to instant, silently directing how the current appears before any account receives composition whatsoever. You ambulate into the identical space dual periods in succession. Nothing in the space has modified. The identical seat by the aperture, the identical accumulation of documents, the identical illumination descending across the plane. However, on the worried period, the intersections appear pointed and the silhouettes seem more substantial. Your appendages contract before you register your preparation. On the tranquil period, the area seems more comfortable, borders refine, and the illumination appears a degree more substantial, as though the space is respiring with you instead of against you. The variation doesn't reside in the space, it resides in the condition that encounters it. We tend to conceptualize feelings manifest following we evaluate the moment, similar to an audio recording supplemented to a completed cinematographic sequence. However, the computation operates initially than that. Emotional circuits calibrate the sensory channels before recognition materializes, modifying what your visual structures prioritize and how your auditory structures evaluate surrounding disturbance. Your cerebrum doesn't exclusively inquiring what exists exterior. It's also inquiring what holds significance presently. That subsequent inquiry establishes the screens. Before a singular cognition develops, the mechanism influences hue, distinction, and concentration to correspond your physical form's preparation. If you're stimulated, the cerebrum may advance reality toward elevated notification, elevating the intensity on indications that suggest danger. If you're protected and established, it expands the range and releases the hold on observation, permitting particulars seem more gentle. This explains why dual individuals can position in the identical corridor and acknowledge remarkably different moments. Worry contracts the visual structure and peripheral sight obscures as though reality is constricting in. Items appear more substantial than they constitute. Motion in the peripheries attracts concentration, similar to an attraction on the appendage. And impartial countenances can interpret a measure more frigid. Happiness executes the contrary. The range expands, hues seem more concentrated, and the consciousness is more prepared to continue on subtlety. On a favorable period, a configuration in timbre texture transforms intriguing. On a tense period, that identical configuration scarcely manifests. The modification represents not a technique of character. It constitutes a direct alteration in how the sensory strata compute the arriving channel. Feeling represents not exclusively a perception. It constitutes a stance the complete cerebrum physical form mechanism assumes toward motion. Apprehension prepares the visual structures to prefer borders and distinction, accelerates examination, and reduces the duration between registering and responding. It constitutes a configuration constructed to identify modifications that may indicate difficulty. Satisfaction comforts the inclination toward pointedness and requests a broader, more gradual observation. You absorb additional situation. You permit intricacy to position without necessitating a resolution. Reflect about how your observation operates when you're absorbed in a tranquil melody versus when you perceive an abrupt impact in the alternative space. The mechanics alter underneath the plane, organizing you either to prepare or to investigate. We also acquire each alternative's internal configurations. In a space with contracted appendages and abbreviated sounds, your physical form initiates generating modifications before you identify why. Minor modifications in someone's countenance, the velocity of their motions, the pressure in their vocalization. These indicators shift through you rapidly, and your personal stance and respiration commence to correspond. The disposition transforms into a distributed range that molds what everyone observes. An assembly at comfort expands the optical device. An assembly on threshold generates everything appear more indicated. None of this relies on anyone declaring how they sense. Your mechanism reflects the conditions surrounding it and incorporates it into observation. There exists another channel that molds this transaction. Underneath pressure, individuals release subtle indications through perspiration that alternatives can acknowledge without registering the origin. Those indications influence the cerebrum toward a more observant condition. You may ambulate into an area and sense a minimal filament of importance before you perceive a language. That alteration transports into sight, audition, and concentration. Generating commonplace sounds seem more pointed, and monotonous illumination appear more frigid. Even when the danger doesn't belong to you, your physical form refreshes its configurations as though it may constitute, and reality assumes that character. You can sense the effect from the interior outward also. The pattern of your cardiac organ, the dimension of your respiration, and the silent pressure in your physical structures constitute the unprocessed substance of a sensation before it possesses a designation. Decelerated, constant respiration, and a released mandible abandon the consciousness liberated to expand. Superficial respirations and a contracted posterior communicate the mechanism to constrict. Your visual structures subsequently inherit those directions. A released physical form requests gentleness in hue and inclination in boundaries. A prepared physical form demands distinction and the most compact trajectory to a resolution. Even minor alterations hold significance. Elevate your cranium and expand your thorax, and the moment can seem less accumulated. Descend interior, and the identical moment contracts. Stance operates similar to a calibration device. Positioning elevated or remaining vertical can influence notification elevated and diminish the perception that everything is compressing in. Descending, particularly for extended intervals, can supply the indication that resources are diminished and the surroundings is substantial. It doesn't represent about necessitating a configuration. It represents about acknowledging that the physical form transmits continuous, refreshes to the cerebrum about the condition of reality. The consciousness responds by calibrating observation to correspond. Modify the contribution from the physical form, even minimally, and the representation on the interior modifies with it. Your countenance also participates. There exists a response channel between manifestation and disposition. A minor genuine suggestion of an expression can shift the indicator not by simulating matters are acceptable, however, by transmitting a different configuration of indications upstream. The physical structures engaged in an expression surrounding the visual structures and oral structure communicate the cerebrum something about protection and interpersonal connection. That communication can comfort pressure in observation, permitting a broader range and reduced danger inclination. A disapproving expression executes the contrary, recruiting concentration toward possible challenges and obscuring the area where more gentle particulars exist. Aroma penetrates directly into this network. Aromas traverse along a more ancient trajectory in the cerebrum, one that connects intimately to recollection and sensation. A recognizable cleansing substance, a fragment of citrus, the initial suggestion of precipitation. They transport an accumulation of ancient connections and transport emotional situation with them. This can alter the manner the space manifests without you registering the origin. An aroma connected to comfort can generate reality seem a degree more comfortable with borders less intense. A fragrance connected to concern can incline everything toward careful. The modification transpires rapidly because aroma and feeling distribute a profound connection in the construction of the cerebrum. Melody operates in a similar stratified manner, particularly when it's connected to history encounters. A composition that once comforted, you can transport backward the identical tranquility, refining observation in the current. Pattern steadies the physical form. Harmony decelerates the respiration, and those alterations in condition expand the optical device. The surroundings itself remains the identical. However, the consciousness's preparation has modified, and the space ensues accordingly in your recognition. This doesn't represent a technique. It constitutes how a condition transforms into a manner of observing. Feeling also supervises what the consciousness permits emerge from recollection. When you sense diminished, connected recollections coordinate more rapidly. The cerebrum employs disposition as a screen to determine which preserved moments are applicable. Melancholy transports similar occurrences forward, reinforcing its personal account. The current subsequently appears to verify the sensation because the history you retrieve corresponds it. When you sense constant, a different collection of recollections materializes to the plain instance of comfort, minor achievements, or durations when a period seemed controllable. Those retrievals provide the current a perception of possibility. In both situations, feeling selects the substance that observation employs to generate logic of the instant. This response channel can transform powerful. A worried condition constricts observation, which generates impartial indicators appear uncertain or adverse, which subsequently summons additional worried recollections, contracting the channel. A tranquil condition expands observation, expands area for impartial or favorable indicators to acknowledge and attracts forward recollections that reinforce accessibility. The sequence shifts rapidly and can operate underneath deliberate cognition. However, it remains a sequence, which signifies it can be affected. Minor participations modify the optical device. A constant exhalation extends the void between perception and understanding. A compact ambulation restores physical structure character and visual structure motion configurations, releasing the inclination toward examination for danger. Refining the observation permitting the visual structures rest on a broader region rather than a singular coordinate indicates protection to the nervous mechanism. Each of these modifications alters the emotional configuration initially and observation ensues. It doesn't represent about refusing a sensation. It represents about providing the mechanism a different initiation coordinate from which to observe. None of this proposes that reality exterior doesn't constitute authentic. It signifies that the actuality you encounter is jointly composed by your internal condition. Your consciousness doesn't exclusively color the representation. It modifies the channel at the origin, determining which elements to accentuate and which to abandon in the surroundings. In this manner, feeling functions as preliminary computation. It molds the information before it transforms your deliberate moment. That's why the identical space can seem intense one period and gentle the subsequent without a singular item shifting. Once you acknowledge how individual this constitutes, everyday alterations generate additional logic. A tense journey abandons you more probable to interpret an impartial remark as frigid. A favorable amusement at consumption generates the interval illumination appear more considerate. The physical form transmits, the cerebrum modifies, and observation modifications in coordination. Comprehending this doesn't represent a technique for necessitated optimism. It constitutes a manner to register the mechanics and identify minor mechanisms you can rotate, particularly when the optical device has constricted more than a circumstance genuinely necessitates. And if reality you observe can incline so comfortably based on an internal configuration, it ensues that exterior contributions can direct that configuration without your registering. The most minimal suggestion of an aroma can calibrate your preparation. A gentle sound in an area can reduce vocalizations and decelerate motions. Subtle indicators in his surroundings can propose how to sense before you establish a cognition about it. That silent steering exists everywhere, and it materializes initially, molding how the subsequent instant appears and how the consciousness determines to encounter it. You advance into a beverage establishment, and your vocalization descends without a cognition. No attendant silenced you. No indication communicated you to be silent. The gentle sound of the beverage apparatus, the sound of receptacles, the diminished vocalization of alternatives establishes a character your cerebrum interprets as reading facility adjacent, and your intensity advances downward to correspond. Or you traverse a receptacle of citrus at the entrance to an establishment and sense an influence to align a platform or eliminate a documentation in the receptacle. You never connect the fresh citrus aroma to the abrupt arrangement in your appendages. It simply seems like your selection. These influences don't request your authorization. They transpire several phases ahead of deliberate recognition. And by the duration you register yourself executing something, the cerebrum has already modified trajectory. That constitutes the silent regulation here. The majority of effects achieve motion before they achieve clarification. The cerebrum addresses subtle indicators similar to a condition's communication, surrounding and constant, and modifies conduct the manner a maritime individual calibrates a navigation element. Illumination establishes character. Arrangement proposes how to shift. Surrounding sounds suggest what's appropriate. Supplement a wandering, disapproving expression or a released appendage, and your personal stance alters to correspond. The deliberate consciousness frequently observes the instant following the alteration, subsequently constructs an organized account about why you functioned that manner. The chronology is disconnected by sufficient that the account seems authentic, even when the activation never traversed your recognition. This transforms difficult to disregard when you observe at how rapidly perceptions direct motion. A compact observation of someone with a decelerated, careful progression can generate your personal phases refine. You don't arrange it. Your motion mechanism calibrates to the interpersonal patterns surrounding you. Visions that propose observation influence sincerity and accommodation, as though a minor interpersonal agreement contracted in the space. Even language flashes that traverse excessively rapidly to interpret can incline disposition. A cheerful categorization beside a monotonous vision can abandon it, sensing more comfortable. An intense one can reduce it. You may acknowledge no variation whatsoever. Nevertheless, your selections transfer several measures in a uniform trajectory. Feelings don't remain interior their possessors. They escape. A contracted mandible modifies respiration in an assembly. An abbreviated character elevates appendages partially across a platform. One individual who remains constant can reduce the cardiac rhythm of a complete assembly. You detect these channels before you traverse a singular phrase. Micro-manifestations oscillate across countenances for portions of a moment. Minor visual structure elevations, compact pressure surrounding the visual structures, and your cerebrum documents them without inquiring you. Stance alterations transport the identical indications. A space where everyone depends forward requests you to depend forward, also to accelerate, to refine your responses. A space with accessible appendages and more gradual motions permits your personal nervous mechanism release its hold. No one declares it. The range exclusively modifies, and you shift with it. Situation executes more than influence. It establishes regulations your cerebrum ensues automatically. More obscured illumination requests more silent vocalizations and more contemplative characters. The sight of documents or examination platforms transports out a vocalization even in areas that aren't reading facilities. Gentle establishment sound environments promote liberated connection and gentle concentration, releasing inflexible cognition sufficient for concepts to connect. An organized space preserves cognitive exertion by diminishing the quantity of items your concentration possesses to coordinate, abandoning additional capacity to arrange or generate. None of this necessitates deliberate authorization. The surroundings delivers a configuration for how to constitute here, and your cerebrum completes it in. There exists another channel at operation that unusually receives designation while it executes its responsibility. Your olfactory structure attends for information your deliberate consciousness never perceives. Physical forms underneath pressure release compositions that alternatives identify. Without registering an aroma, your observation can emerge. You examine a minimal additional. You sense somewhat on threshold with no transparent origin. Apprehension possesses a similar transmission. It organizes the individuals adjacent to contract their concentration, respond more rapidly, and shift carefully. These indications don't declare themselves the manner a vocalization would. They modify limits profoundly in sensory and emotional circuits, calibrating preparation upward or downward based on what alternative physical forms communicate. This responsiveness to interpersonal concentration operates in the surroundings also. Minor alterations in a space modifications in silhouette Moderate motions at the periphery of sight can generate you align or rotate your cranium before you acknowledge why you shifted. You may designate it sensing observed. More frequently, it constitutes a detection mechanism calibrated to subtle configurations that hold significance for protection and interpersonal position. That detection mechanism operates more rapidly than the account you communicate about it subsequently. By the duration you identify the origin, your physical form has already assumed a stance decelerated or accelerated, organized to acknowledge or circumvent. Expression itself can attract at the mechanism with scarcely an indication. Language flashes excessively rapidly to designate. Continue flexing evaluation. A countenance coordinated with a momentary favorable indicator can appear more agreeable instant subsequently. An adverse indication can establish a minimal frigidity. You don't recollect observing the indicator, which constitutes the objective. Your evaluation mechanism incorporates micro-information, subsequently delivers deliberate assessment, a conclusion with no documentation. It doesn't represent deception, it constitutes productivity. The cerebrum preserves deliberate capacity by permitting reduced strata manage the initial transition. These effects accumulate with the incomplete channels that adhere to concentration. A communication you intended to respond, a responsibility you abandoned partially executed, a dialogue that paused at a tense instant. Each one maintains a minimal intensity. That attraction doesn't seem like a substantial interruption. It seems like a gentle resonance you cannot deactivate. It colors disposition and diminishes concentration, occasionally sufficient to generate rest. Completing the channel releases the pressure, which explains why examining a designation or transmitting a compact response can seem disproportionately comforting. The consciousness monitors accessible objectives to preserve you coordinated with future motions. However, the monitoring itself occupies area you could employ for something alternative. Interpersonal chronology strata on superior. When individuals believe they're being observed, even by minimal indicators, they function more generously or adhere more intimately to declared regulations. In an assembly, distributed responsibility can evaporate as each individual pauses for someone alternative to shift. Eliminate the assembly and responsibility refines. You advance in because the circumstance seems like yours to manage. This doesn't represent an imperfection in character. It constitutes an alteration in situation that modifies how the cerebrum evaluates danger, exertion, and interpersonal expense. Reflecting constitutes a silent connection between consciousnesses. Correspond someone's velocity, resonance emotion. Refine your vocalization to their character, and comfort develops without a singular direct appeal. The individual seems observed at a stratum underneath language. You don't possess to orchestrate it. Your mechanism tends to reflect automatically when you sense protected. When confidence is minimal, you maintain backward and the coordination never transpires. These micro-modifications preserve dialogue refined and diminish resistance. They also demonstrate how extensively connection depends on coordination rather than assertion. Concentration is also subjected to a configuration inclination that generates novel concepts appear to manifest everywhere once you acquire them. Following perceiving a designation, you register it recurrently as though reality abruptly completed with it. Reality didn't modify. Your screens did. What was previously eliminated as disturbance presently indicates as applicable, which can generate the concept seem more significant or important than it constitutes. That alteration can direct selections, acquisitions, even convictions, because prominence molds what you reflect and what you disregard. Aroma maintains vocalizing in the surroundings as you shift through areas. A suggestion of citrus generates organizing seem natural. Cleansing similar elements indicate cognitions of purity and regulation adherence. Comfortable spices request continuing and dialogue. You don't require to acknowledge any of these aromas for them to operate. They function similar to an appendage on the intensity mechanism a particular conducts. rotating them upward or downward a degree. Stance executes the identical from the interior outward. Vertical stance indicates preparation to your personal cerebrum. Descended appendages supply a diminished resource channel that establishes anticipations for the remainder of the instant. The response operates dual directions. A minor expression can alter disposition. A more constant respiration can diminish cognitive interference. These don't represent consciousness over substance techniques. They constitute connections in a dual direction sequence where physical form condition and cognitive condition refresh each alternative. Position everything collectively, and it transforms transparent that conduct is unusually composed by a singular transparent selection. It's jointly composed by area, aroma, sound, stance, assembly character, wandering language, minor countenance motions, and accessible channels, attracting on concentration. You continue directing. You continue selecting. However, the mechanism possesses authority assistance constructed in, and the trajectory plane holds significance more than you conceptualize. A majority of duration, this doesn't represent manipulation. It constitutes the nervous mechanism executing what it evolved to execute. Respond rapidly to configurations that project results, preserve exertion where it can, and preserve you coordinated with interpersonal anticipations without flooding deliberate cognition with constant micro-determinations. This explains why minor modifications in surroundings compensate substantial returns. Eliminate the workspace and your concentration obtains space to respire. Supplement an indicator for silence and your vocalization ensues. Establish one perceptible notification to complete a continuing responsibility and the reduced stratum pressure comforts. When an area transmits a regulation, your cerebrum perceives it and modifies. When individuals surrounding you transport tranquility, your personal mechanism acquires a velocity that maintains constant. And when subtle notifications resonate pressure in the atmosphere, appendages contracted, silhouettes altering you modify before language materialize. The more you register these channels, the less individual certain impulses seem, and the more functional they transform. If a disposition materialized from nowhere, perhaps it transported in on the space. If importance elevated with no transparent origin, perhaps an accessible channel summoned for concentration. If you sensed observed, perhaps you acknowledged an alteration at the periphery of sight. None of this excuses conduct. It clarifies the concealed framework that molds it. You don't require to observe each connection for the mechanism to operate. However, once you detect the configuration, you can influence the structure, modify an aroma, modify an illumination, establish your respiration, and observe your motions ensue along. This doesn't represent a reduction of operation. It constitutes an improved representation. You're not a protected receptacle advancing instructions exterior. You constitute an animated mechanism in dialogue with its surroundings, absorbing suggestions, transmitting indications, and remaining adaptive. The surroundings generates propositions. Your physical form interprets them. Awareness materializes a pulse subsequently to provide narration. When you operate with that sequence instead of against it, the advancement and attraction transforms more comfortable to navigate, and the subsequent silent modification seems less enigmatic and more similar to a capacity you can refine one minor indicator at a duration. Maintain your observation on dual neutral rectangles. Identical shade, identical radiance. Nevertheless, one appears more obscured than the alternative because of the hues surrounding it. Or observe at a motionless matrix until it appears to oscillate. Nothing altered, however your consciousness executed. The cerebrum depends on situation to project what should constitute there. And in the majority of everyday circumstances, those shortcuts assist. In these false perceptions, the projections disagree with the contribution and your encounter inclines. You sense certainty, and nevertheless the presentation never modified. That silent inconsistency your perception, demanding one matter. The information expressing another exposes how extensively of observing constitutes an optimal estimation executed at elevated velocity. The consequence is constant, reproducible, and somewhat disconcerting because you detect the mechanisms rotating underneath, attempting to resolve a reality that declines to position motionless. Presently, acquire an elementary moment in an establishment. You observe downward to respond to communication, observe upward, and declare the surface appears the identical. Exclusively subsequently, do you comprehend the presentation containers have been reorganized or the composition surface has altered to a novel arrangement. You were there. Your visual structures were accessible, and nevertheless you overlooked the exchange. Or reflect about requesting a beverage while the individual behind the surface advances away and another individual assumes their position mid-phrase. Numerous individuals remain concentrated on the compensation quantity or the inquiry about Barry, and the alteration navigates past unregistered. This constitutes modification unconsciousness in elementary sight. Concentration determines what receives represented with particularity. When concentration secures to one portion of the moment, the remainder transforms into a configuration. If a modification transpires during a compact disruption enclosure, an observation to the aspect, the cerebrum weaves the moment backward collectively from presumptions. Those presumptions are typically accurate. However, when they're not, you obtain a definite perception of continuity where there was a separation. The identical weaving transpires interior your visual structures. Extremely literally, there manifests a digit magnitude void in each visual range where the visual pathway encounters the eye surface. There exist no illumination detecting structures there. You should observe a vacant circle, and nevertheless you don't. Your consciousness completes it continuously, with surfaces and hues acquired from the surroundings. The mechanism operates without exertion. You shift your observation, and the segment advances. However, your encounter remains complete. This completing manifests beyond that physical void also. When you close, reality doesn't oscillate because your cerebrum refines the disruption. Silhouettes and reflections suppress particularity. However, you continue sensing uniform planes. The production constitutes a continuous panorama that never manifests interrupted or fragmented. Even though the unprocessed contribution comprises voids and disorderly portions, from the interior, it seems like uninterrupted actuality. From the exterior, it constitutes a refined composite, every presently and subsequently. Another variety of connection demonstrates through. A dialogue seems like one you've possessed before in a position you cannot entirely designate. The atmosphere possesses a peculiar recurrence quality, and the current instant inclines toward the already recognized. That sensation of repetition frequently diminishes as rapidly as it materializes. However, its certainty can be startling. Behind that sensation, identification mechanisms temporarily misalign. A current configuration establishes sufficiently intimate to traverse indications to activate recognition, even when you cannot identify a corresponding occurrence. Neural circuits in and surrounding recollection configurations mark the current as recollected, while the situation infrastructure postpones. The outcome constitutes a flash of recognition without a location. It doesn't represent a prediction. It constitutes a chronology complication. A minor advance indication that generates the novel seem ancient for a cardiac beat or duel. Subsequently, the arrangement fragments connect. The perception diminishes and the period advances forward. These disturbances perceptible in false perceptions and that sensation of repetition resonate in your perception of chronology. In danger, moments appear to expand. You register sound diminishing to the peripheries, respiration rotating audible, and each cardiac beat transforming separate. It doesn't represent that exterior chronological devices decelerate. It constitutes that the cerebrum elevates sampling and preserves additional particularity per portion of duration. Subsequently, when you retrieve the occurrence, the recollection seems concentrated and stratified, which your consciousness interprets as an extended interval. In progression, the contrary transpires. Your concentration constricts, surrounding a singular channel composing, executing, resolving, and you acquire reduced cognitive captures. Reduced indicators signify reduced indicators in recollection, and durations condense into a compact assembly when you observe backward. The subjective transition modifies with responsibility requirements and stimulation without any modification in the exterior reality's velocity. That adaptability preserves capacities concentrated where they hold significance predominantly. The configuration recurs with motionless visions that manifest a shift. A matrix with elevated distinction borders establishes off-motion identifiers in the visual mechanism, which evolved to mark modifications across the range. The cerebrum depends toward identifying motion rather than overlooking it, because in the natural surroundings, overlooking motion could be expensive. That inclination transforms apparent when a motionless configuration provokes a transfer that doesn't exist. The identical applies for planes that appear to expand when they constitute level. Regional distinction indicators propose dimension, and your cerebrum acknowledges the proposition. No novel illumination achieves the eye surface. However, the indicated form prevails. You don't alternate between actualities. You encounter one consistent moment that transpires to be incorrect about a particularity. The false perception seems substantial because the mechanism that generates it constitutes the identical mechanism that generates commonplace observation constant. Modification unconsciousness operates not exclusively with physical moments, however, with interpersonal ones. In a dialogue, you monitor character and significance. Therefore, a moderate modification in stance, or an exchange of an item, and traverse unregistered. Your consciousness invests capacity in interpreting language and purpose, permitting diminished priority characteristics become indistinct. If someone alters a covering or eliminates vision apparatus during a compact rotation of the cranium, numerous individuals malfunction to register, and they remain definite, nothing altered. Repeatedly, concentration constitutes the entrance. What it doesn't acknowledge with complete precision receives reconstructed from anticipations and comprehensive configurations. Those reconstructions seem commonplace because they nearly perpetually correspond reality, sufficiently adequately to steer motion. Exclusively when an investigation or a sophisticated presentation discloses the inconsistency, do you observe the expense of those productivities. The vacant area completing constitutes a particular situation of a comprehensive regulation. The mechanism constructs continuity wherever possible. That tendency clarifies why reality doesn't activate or oscillate with each pointed visual structure motion. Between visual structure advances, the cerebrum suppresses the indistinctness and employs projection to preserve the moment constant. Minor inconsistencies vanish into the representation. With the physical vacant area, the cerebrum employs encompassing surface, borders, and hue to compose in the absent segment. You can generate an item vanish into it by coordinating it with consideration. The instant you alter your observation, the item returns. The majority of duration, you never register the void whatsoever. That invisibility constitutes the indication of a mechanism executing its responsibility. That sensation of repetition emphasizes the identical motivation for consistency, however, along the progression of chronology. The mechanism would rather declare something recognizable than position with uncertainty. If configuration corresponding neural structures identify an intersection with preserved indications, they transmit an indication that expresses this corresponds. For an instant, the marker materializes before situation, and you sense a certainty that subsequently demonstrates baseless. This sensation transports weight because it constitutes the identical indication that typically assists you traverse recurring circumstances. It's beneficial the majority of duration. In the malfunction, you obtain the practicality without the precision. Chronology distortion ensues an adaptive sequence also. Danger indicators advance the cerebrum to document additional particulars, generating a subsequent reproduction seem expanded. Sequence condenses because the cerebrum diminishes sampling of redundant information. That explains why journeys can reduce in recollection and why novel journeys seem more extended. The modification in subjective magnitude doesn't represent a deviation. It constitutes an intelligent distribution of capacities that prioritizes novel and significant information for particularized preservation. When you subsequently contemplate, the concentration of preserved indicators molds how extended the duration seems. What connects these occurrences collectively constitutes the constant dependence on projection, void completing, and selective concentration. The consciousness constructs a reality that constitutes refined and operable. When actuality alters in manners that circumvent the entrances during an observation away, a closure, a responsibility alteration, or an elevated burden instant, the cerebrum presumes continuity and segments the variation. False perceptions, the uncertain exchange at the surface, the vanishing item in the vacant area, and the peculiar resonance of that sensation of repetition all expose the framework. None of this indicates a disrupted mechanism. It indicates a mechanism enhanced for velocity and constancy, one that depends on situation and typically prevails. If the cerebrum can generate dual identical hues appear different based on surroundings, it can also generate dual identical instants seem different based on internal condition. In apprehension, a moment completes with additional information. In progression, it evacuates out. In both situations, the encounter appears apparent from the interior. Your perception of accuracy doesn't oscillate. It refreshes. The refreshes are steered by what assists you shift, determine, and continue with restricted capacity. These malfunctions constitute the peripheries where assembly demonstrates. They constitute gentle, reproducible verifications that observation doesn't represent a reflection, however, a representation. You encounter the representation as actuality because the correspondence is compact the majority of duration. When it advances, you obtain a perception of the mechanism situation flexing hue, concentration determining manifestation, recollection indications establishing off incorrect recognition, and emotional stimulation extending or condensing the sensed magnitude of an instant. The instruction doesn't represent that you cannot depend your perceptions whatsoever. It constitutes that your perceptions and your cerebrum accommodate to deliver an operable reality, modifying out disturbance, refining voids, and declaring continuity. Once you register how frequently the mechanism modifies on your account, a more silent comprehension ensues. If observing, chronology, and recognition can all alter underneath the effect of situation and condition. Subsequently, the individual you sense yourself to constitute interior. Those encounters may not constitute established either. The identical projecting adaptive infrastructure that generates a neutral rectangle appear more obscured can influence how you interpret a countenance, how extended a dialogue seems, and how definite you constitute that you've constituted here before. The representation refreshes, and you shift with it, frequently without registering the appendage on the calibration. The cerebrum you transport presently doesn't represent the cerebrum you emerged with a year previously. It doesn't represent the one you possessed before you acquired your initial access designation, became familiar with the sensation of a novel seat, or selected a minor pattern you scarcely register anymore. Each of those instants abandon minimal indications that supplement upward, subtle modifications in connection that alter how indications proceed, which trajectories obtain priority, and how comfortably configurations secure into position. Over duration, these indications gather similar to minor channels in material. Certain intensify with recurrence. Alternatives diminish when the encounter vanishes from your existence. The outcome constitutes an animated configuration that reflects what you execute, what you compensate concentration to, and what you rehearse. Acquisition reinforces particular trajectories while reducing alternatives. When you recur a novel motion, the identical chain of neural structures activates repeatedly and repeatedly until the trajectory obtains productive. When you investigate a concept frequently sufficient that it commences to seem recognizable, the connection between connected concepts establishes. When you discontinue employing a capacity for an extended interval, indications reroute and the ancient pathway constricts. This continuous reconstruction doesn't represent theoretical. It constitutes physical. Connections reinforce or release. Structures develop or withdraw minor components. Networks alter their coordination, so activity proceeds along more rapid trajectories. What seems like exertion initially transforms more refined because the infrastructure has reorganized to reinforce it. Rehearsal constructs configuration, not as a declaration, however, as a calculable reality. Individuals who calibrate their concentration for several periods each period discover that it obtains more comfortable to return to a coordinate of concentration following an interruption. Individuals who operate through a novel expression commence to retrieve language more rapidly, subsequently detect structure configurations that once advanced by. Recurrence doesn't exclusively improve execution. It restores limits, diminishes disturbance, and refines chronology between cerebral regions that require to coordinate. Capacities manifest as more refined chronology, more compact coordination, and more transparent transfers between regions that once struggled to remain in coordination. Certain configurations of calibration abandon transparent indications. Years of traversing intricate pathway networks correspond with more substantial, more connected regions connected to spatial recollection and trajectory identification. The requirements accumulate encoding indicators, arranging trajectories, refreshing positions continuously, and the neural territory reinforcing those operations expands. A similar configuration manifests in individuals who rehearse devices that necessitate rapid coordination between audition and motion. The connections between auditory and motion mechanisms reinforce, generating the dialogue between them more rapid and more precise. The objective constitutes elementary. Recur a responsibility that necessitates a particular collection of calculations, and the configurations that execute those calculations modify to manage the burden. What enumerates as a capacity constitutes broader than academic labor or physical activity configuration identification in your occupation. The regulations of a particular interpersonal surroundings, even how you manage frustration. Each one can calibrate circuits. A patron assistance sequence that instructs you to pause, respire, and respond with a tranquil expression transforms into a configuration you can obtain underneath pressure. With duration, the response doesn't represent an execution. It constitutes a novel standard. The identical applies for chains your physical form acquires. Initially, a novel stance seems uncomfortable, similar to maintaining an instrument incorrectly in a mechanism. Subsequently, your physical structures establish. Minor stabilizers activate earlier, and the nervous mechanism anticipates equilibrium amendments before you oscillate. This constitutes acquisition. Also, the cerebrum can also incorporate contributions it was never constructed to obtain. Individuals transport attachments that oscillate when they confront direction. Initially, the perception constitutes exclusively an oscillating indicator. Following intervals, numerous acknowledge a silent perception of orientation even when the apparatus is disconnected, as though a representation has established precisely underneath recognition. Alternatives employ technology that rotates hue information into sound, configurations, or converts spatial arrangements into contact vibrations. Over duration, the consciousness discontinues addressing these indications as external. It connects them into observation, permitting an individual sense position or perceive hue as though those channels were perpetually there. These don't represent entertainment techniques. They demonstrate how adaptable observation constitutes. when the cerebrum identifies a constant correspondence between indications and significance. Emotional acquisition reconstructs circuits also. Tranquil rehearsal, similar to elementary respiration concentration, can modify how powerfully pressure trajectories activate. With recurrence, the networks that supervise impulses and concentration transform somewhat more substantial, while the mechanisms that activate notification can silence more rapidly following a wave. Over durations, that interprets into more compact recuperation durations and reduced excessive responses when something malfunctions. On the alternative aspect, extended danger or unpredictability can calibrate the cerebrum to depend toward observation. Indications that once acknowledged as impartial select a subtle border. The limit for possible danger reduces. The physical form's organization mechanisms alter on initially and remain on more extended. It constitutes adaptive when protection is ambiguous. However, it can transform exhausting when the situation has modified and the patterns do not. Even elementary rehearsals that appear gentle can abandon indications. An everyday pattern of registering several beneficial instants, someone maintaining an entrance, a challenge that resolved steers concentration toward interpersonal indicators that had been diminishing into the surroundings. Over duration, the circuits that identify and evaluate those indicators attract more promptly. The consequence doesn't represent exclusively a sensation. It constitutes an alteration in what receives registered initially, where understanding establishes, and how rapidly the cerebrum returns to standard following a disruption in the period. Numerous individuals underestimate how environmental modification molds the cerebrum. Ambulating a novel trajectory modifies the collection of indicators you encode. Altering the sequence of a sequence necessitates arrangement mechanisms to reconstruct their standards. Operating in a moderately more frigid space influences your physical form supervision mechanisms into a different pattern, which subtly alters your perception of notification. These constitute minor influences, however. Across intervals, they diversify the encounters your cerebrum must establish. Modification of contribution obstructs trajectories from transforming inflexible. It preserves the mechanism prepared to modify. Instructing something you exclusively acquired constitutes another dependable reconstructor. When you clarify a technique to someone alternative, you expose voids in your personal representation and secure the essential phases with language and motions. The mechanism recruits expression networks, motion arrangement for presentation, and interpersonal concentration mechanisms, subsequently connects them to the identical concept. Those supplementary connections generate the recollection more comfortable to identify subsequently, even underneath pressure. Composing by appendage supplements another stratum. The accurate motion of establishing configurations connects symbols to motions, which provides the cerebrum another trajectory to retrieve the appropriate configuration when it holds significance. Rest generates these modifications adhere. Following a period of rehearsal or innovation, the resting cerebrum reproduces portions of the operation and reinforces the connections that generated beneficial conclusions. This nocturnal arranging refines disturbance, reduces trajectories that didn't assist, and reinforces chronology that executed. Individuals frequently emerge, capable to execute a chain more fluidly than the night before, not because they attempted more intensely, however, because the mechanism continued calibrating disconnected. Overlook that mechanism frequently sufficient, and acquisition discontinues. The trajectories you attempted to construct remain inadequate, and even ancient capacities demonstrate somewhat additional fluctuation. Not every modification constitutes permanent. If you discontinue interpreting composition documentation for durations, the velocity of identification decelerates. If you assume an extended interruption from a subsequent expression, obtainability develops uncertain. However, the indications don't completely vanish. When you return, the elevation is more compact. Ancient networks emerge, identify each alternative, and re-establish their patterns more rapidly than they executed the initial occasion. The cerebrum recollects its personal arrangements even when they silence. The functional conclusion constitutes direct. Recurrence directs the instrument. Rest establishes the configuration. Preserve the rehearsal occasions compact, distributed, and modified sufficient that the mechanism maintains compensating concentration. Permit rest execute its component. Expose your perceptions to novel information channels, even in minor quantities. Supplement somewhat physical form to your acquisition. Vocalize audibly. Compose by appendage. Motion when you retrieve phases. Connect understanding to motion, so additional networks distribute the responsibility. This constant reconstruction signifies identification constitutes less similar to a formation and more similar to a workshop. You don't represent an established collection of characteristics. You constitute the total of circuits that have been calibrated by what you execute recurrently, what you circumvent, what you register, and what you recuperate from. That doesn't represent a declaration. It constitutes the physical condition of your nervous mechanism at any instant. It also signifies the entrance is accessible. You can modify the trajectories by modifying the rehearsal. You can alter the limits by altering what you expose yourself to. The you that seems constant from period to period constitutes a beneficial continuity constructed from continuous refreshes. When the mechanism constitutes this adaptable, the silent inquiries obtain more audible. If rehearsal reconstructs resolution trajectories, where do selections initiate? If concentration calibration modifies what accesses recognition, who constitutes executing the concentrating? If rest modifies the repository, what constitutes the connection between the modifier and the narrative it communicates? These inquiries don't represent remote philosophy. They characterize the encounter of existing with a cerebrum that is perpetually reconstructing itself, frequently precisely underneath the stratum where you can observe it transpire. What transforms transparent constitutes that the boundaries of observation are broader than they appear. Supplement a refined, uniform channel of indications, and the cerebrum will examine for a configuration it can absorb. Difficulty a pattern with gentle recurrent modification, and the mechanism will reconstruct its standards without intensity. Pressure a circuit excessively intensely, and it can establish a protective channel. Comfort it backward with patient, diminished intensity. Rehearsal, and it can identify a more protected established coordinate. The filament operating through everything constitutes elementary sufficient to maintain in a singular respiration. Encounter reconstructs configuration. Configuration steers encounter, and the sequence continues. You sense like the identical individual because your narrative connects the periods. However, the infrastructure underneath that narrative is modifying at a microscopic stratum while you operate. Rest, acquire, and disregard, which elevates a final more silent inquiry that the subsequent phase will assume upward. If the infrastructure maintains altering and the narrative maintains modifying, what precisely constitutes the constant someone who appears to constitute here, registering at everything? There manifests a coordinate each night when the period commences to release. Designations become indistinct, the space refines, and your cognitions don't coordinate as organized as they executed a duration previously. You continue alert. However, you're not directing the identical manner. The consciousness comforts off the regulation, and the silent mechanisms that observe and arrange commence to assume control. Respiration evens out. Physical structures discontinue negotiating for concentration. The constant narration diminishes to a gentler resonance. This constitutes the transfer. Awareness releases its hold, and the nocturnal operation advances in without declaration. You don't sense the transition in one refined instant. However, the modification constitutes authentic. The cerebrum is organizing to execute labor you cannot execute while you're alert. Rest appears inactive from the exterior. However, interior it's occupied. The mechanisms that preserve, arrange, and incorporate your period don't operate adequately underneath illumination. They prefer the obscurity. As you transfer, the cerebrum commences shifting vulnerable, recent encounters into more constant networks, reflect of a workspace occupied in notations. The alert period disperses them. The night accumulates, traverses references, and documents. Certain items are eliminated. Certain obtained connected to more ancient repositories you didn't recognize held significance. You're not establishing a flawless documentation. You're constructing a representation that operates more adequately subsequent occasion you require it. The cerebral region executes a central function in this transfer, establishing downward the trajectory for what will constitute obtainable subsequently and what receives misplaced in the disturbance. Not all recollections are addressed equivalently. The consciousness evaluates significance, not exclusively substance. Emotional occurrences obtain a different variety of management at night. During particular phases of rest, the cerebrum rehearses and restructures. Moments from the period return beyond sequence, woven into accounts that seem peculiar, however transport purpose. A disagreement from consumption manifests with different characters and a novel conclusion. An apprehension returns with the intensity reduced. These don't represent random portions. They constitute the cerebrum examining responses in a diminished danger environment, reducing the pointed peripheries off pressure so you can confront similar pressures with more constant appendages. If an apprehension constitutes stubborn, it may access repeatedly, each occasion altering configuration as mechanisms attempt to dissolve it. Rapid visual structure motion rest propels extensively of this emotional arranging. Visual structure motions activate in, physical form character descends, and imagery radiates. The cerebrum employs this phase to incorporate concentrated instance into broader configurations without reactivating the complete pressure burden. It constitutes rehearsal without the physical form responding. The outcome constitutes that the subsequent period you can retrieve the occurrence while sensing less controlled by it. Not every nocturnal vision resolves organized, certainly. However, across nights the inclination attracts toward supervision. This constitutes one justification why disagreements seem less burdened following a complete night, or why sorrow can shift from unprocessed to manageable in minor phases as rest executes its silent labor. Challenge resolution flourishes in this surroundings. While you rest, your consciousness releases the inflexible regulations that alert reasoning necessitates. Concepts that position distance separated during the period can presently distribute a boundary. A partially completed melody identifies its absent rotation when dual unconnected elements coordinate. A stubborn calculation phase expands following the cerebrum connects a fresh trajectory from a different domain. Authors emerge with the phrase that wouldn't materialize. Technicians observe a more elementary construction because an overlooked limitation was released in the night, permitting an improved arrangement to plane. Rest reorganizes, assembles, and examines novel advances between concepts, which explains why responses can seem apparent upon emerging, even if they were imperceptible the night before. Occasionally, the comprehension materializes interior a nocturnal vision. The narrative may transport the sensation of the resolution rather than the phases. You emerge with certainty about where to observe or what to eliminate, even if the nocturnal vision was peculiar. That constitutes the advantage. The configuration underneath the peculiarity directs you toward a more refined representation. Creative labor advantages from this alteration in configuration because it employs extent. Rest provides you extent without requesting exertion. It doesn't require your deliberate concentration to attempt combinations. It operates through them as component of its standard sequence. Capacity acquisition also reinforces. Recurrence during the period establishes downward the unprocessed composition. Nocturnal rehearsal refines it. Chronology refines out. Deviations that maintained recurrent transform less probable as the cerebrum evaluates versions and refreshes the motion arrangement. Musical performers frequently register that sections seem more comfortable the period following. Expression acquirers discover that language adhere and advance off the vocalization mechanism with reduced resistance. The advantage doesn't represent enchantment. It constitutes the outcome of concentrated establishment when disruption is diminished. With reduced novel contributions flooding the mechanism, the cerebrum can secure in what holds significance and eliminate what doesn't. The standard configuration network, which rotates self-directed cognition and extended range connections, remains operative in manners that reinforce this establishment. It assists incorporating individual significance into the substance being preserved. That's why your acquisition inclines toward your appreciations and objectives even while you rest. Filaments of identification intertwined with novel information generating. Retrieval not exclusively possible, however applicable. When you retrieve it subsequently, it corresponds you. And because it corresponds, you employ it, which reinforces it additionally. The expense of overlooking this nocturnal mechanism manifests rapidly. Without sufficient rest, the cerebral region cannot execute its responsibility adequately. Novel information doesn't adhere. You can observe at the identical document, recite the information for an instant, and subsequently observe them diminish a pulse subsequently. You attempt to acquire a responsibility and maintain releasing fragments. The repository is complete, however the reception platform is sealed. Emotional regulation receives a disruption. Also, irritation elevates, melancholy continues. Minor pressures seem more substantial because the mechanism that typically calibrates downward the previous period's intensity hasn't executed its operation. Resolution generating obtains disorderly as concentration expressions. You attempt to advance through on determination and discover that your patience and operational recollection don't reinforce you upward. Observation commences to distort when rest obligation accumulates. Micro-rest periods advance in. Compact postponements when the cerebrum obtains portions of moments of termination you didn't authorize. You may discover yourself closing and misplacing the filament of a phrase or incorrectly interpreting an elementary indication. In intense situations, the boundary between nocturnal vision imagery and alert contribution becomes indistinct and rapid peculiar perceptions intrude. It doesn't represent intense cinematography. It constitutes an indication that networks are malfunctioning to preserve a constant representation without nocturnal preservation. Response durations extend. Danger evaluations deteriorate. You sense like you're current, however your mechanisms aren't coordinated. Even modest limitations on rest degrade execution. Somewhat reduced each night accumulates. The acquisition you conceptualized, you preserved, remains vulnerable. Emotional remainder gathers. The documentation responsibility obtains accelerated and disorganized. You're more responsive and less adaptable because your consciousness is transporting unsorted substance into each novel period. Individuals frequently attribute determination for this decline. However, the challenges monitor backward to overlooked preservation. When the nocturnal operation doesn't operate, the period operation cannot maintain upward. The substance of nocturnal visions doesn't represent a concealed communication you must interpret. However, the mechanism that generates them assists transparent functions. It examines responses, reduces heated encounters, and identifies configuration in unstructured disturbance. Nocturnal visions incorporate sensory indications, partially established arrangements, and ancient recollections to observe how they may correspond. The precise narrative configuration holds significance less than the weaving. Following a collection of nights, you frequently emerge with a more transparent perception of what to execute subsequent, or with reduced importance surrounding challenges that seemed pointed before. Your standard alters towards constancy because the excessive burden has been computed into configurations. Rest also reinforces the components of identification that depend on narrative consistency. When recollections establish, they execute so in connection to the narrative you're communicating about yourself. which maintains evolving. The cerebrum refreshes that narrative at night, coordinating novel encounters with more ancient configurations or reassigning them to improved classifications. A malfunction transforms feedback. An achievement transforms a reference coordinate for future danger. If a period transports substantial feeling, the night frequently modifies your stance toward it, influencing you toward acknowledgement or determination. Over duration, these modifications supplement upward to character modifications that seem progressive, however are constructed moment by moment in the obscurity. Individuals occasionally attempt to manipulate this by necessitating delayed labor or exchanging rest for supplementary durations. However, the exchange is inadequate. You obtain additional duration on the chronological device and reduced duration when the cerebrum can incorporate what you executed with what you require to execute. The outcome constitutes additional exertion and reduced advantage. When you rest, you're not misplacing durations. You're investing them in preservation, refinement, and supervision. This investment compensates as precision, tranquility, and capacity during the period. The sensation of transferring into rest can be employed as an indicator. As cognitions release, you can establish an inquiry gently, without pressure, not a requirement for a response, exclusively a trajectory. The consciousness will assume it underneath consideration and operate while you rest. You don't require to pursue it. Permit the mechanism operate. In the morning, examine what planed. Frequently, the response doesn't represent a complete resolution. However, an improved subsequent phase, which constitutes everything you require to continue. Each night this sequence recurs, recollections shift, feelings establish, capacities refine, novel connections establish, misplaced filaments are severed. The result constitutes subtle. You emerge as someone moderately different from the individual who advanced to rest. The modification is compact across one night. However, across numerous nights, it defines a trajectory. Rest functions as the imperceptible constructor, molding disposition through nocturnal visions, molding recollection through establishment, molding character through continuous incorporation. The labor is silent. However, it constitutes constant, and it preserves you consistent in a reality that maintains shifting. And precisely as the night reconstructs the period, alternative concealed mechanisms are functioning, also modifying the manner concentration, observation, and even your perception of self materialize collectively without requesting authorization. All period extended, observation, recollection, and feeling direct you without requesting authorization. Contemplation constitutes the instant you rotate toward the channel and select how it shifts. It doesn't represent unusual. It initiates with an elementary stance, a constant respiration, and a constricted responsibility. Preserve concentration where you position it. That minor action indicates the cerebrum to arrange differently. When you pause and establish upward several periods of concentration, you're selecting which trajectories to rehearse. You're determining what the consciousness should obtain adequate at. And the cerebrum, opportunistic as perpetually, commences to reassign capacities. It's similar to returning to a space you exist in and ultimately shifting the components so you can ambulate through it without contacting your appendage. Within periods of establishing into a silent, constant pattern of respiration, a configuration emerges behind the anterior region. Networks that assist with observation and redirecting concentration initiate assuming the priority. At the identical duration, the circuits that advance important, pressure substantial indications commence reducing their intensity. It doesn't necessitate an enigmatic condition. It appears similar to minor continuous amendments. Register the respiration. Detect the wandering cognition. Indicator a gentle return. That channel generates a response indication the cerebrum can employ. The more frequently you operate it, the more transparent it obtains. The precision doesn't exclusively constitute cognitive. It manifests as an alteration in the equilibrium between superior downward regulation and inferior upward responsiveness. You continue sensing feelings. They exclusively materialize with additional area surrounding them. Over intervals and durations, the rehearsal abandons an indication you can direct to. Visual investigations has acknowledged more substantial surface in regions engaged in concentration and self-supervision and authentic modifications in locations that compute recollection and pressure. Those alterations correspond unto everyday existence in silent, however functional manners. You pause for a moment before responding a tense communication. You register the initial suggestion of a descending sequence and advance out of it initially. Startled responses release. Recuperation from a disruption accelerates. Even on periods you don't position formally, the transfer manifests as reduced overlooked particulars, reduced cognitive portions following disruptions, and a more constant standard during modest disorder. Capacity develops as a correspondence between mechanisms. Extended duration rehearsal reinforces the connections among networks that monitor concentration, oppose interruption, and transport concentration backward when it advances. That collection constitutes what you employ when you interpret a section without reinterpreting a configuration 5 occasions, or attend to a companion without cognitively composing your response. These don't represent unusual capacities. They constitute calibratable characteristics. And similar to any calibration, uniformity defeats intensity. 5 silent periods recurrent frequently can hold significance more than a singular extended occasion ensued by an interval of disturbance. The cerebrum prefers patterns it can project. Provide it a dependable indicator, and it will construct surrounding it. If this seems limited to the support, it doesn't. The identical adaptability manifests when you acquire any novel configuration. Novel language advance vocalization mechanisms to coordinate differently. A novel device necessitates chronology circuits to coordinate with audition and motion. Even manual composition rehearsal refines regulation channels that reinforce interpretation and arrangement. Each recurrence reinforces minor, particular connections. Over duration, those connections intensify into trajectories the consciousness can traverse rapidly. The consequence doesn't represent theoretical. Trajectories transform more comfortable to maintain in consciousness. Designations adhere more frequently. You alternate responsibilities with reduced remainder, adhering to the peripheries of cognition. Contemplation supplements a particular rotation because the capacity it calibrates constitutes the superior capacity that molds the remainder, where concentration advances, what obtains priority, and how rapidly you recuperate from transfer that generates the rehearsal a mechanism for disposition also. Individuals frequently acknowledge that their standard transforms less fluctuating. When a pressure establishes, the mechanism continues responding. However, the inclination downward is more pointed. Tranquility returns more rapidly. That configuration reflects modifications observed in the cerebrum's danger response centers. Meanwhile, the locations that reinforce arrangement and revaluation remain more obtainable underneath burden. In functional designations, it constitutes the variation between recovering a moment subsequently versus a duration subsequently. The cerebrum's preparedness to modify doesn't constitute restricted to what you compensate concentration to. It will also assume completely novel varieties of contribution if provided a uniform, significant correspondence. Apparatuses that rotate trajectory into a gentle oscillation on the physical form instruct the transporter, where direction exists without cognizing about it. Following sufficient exposure, orientation seems less similar to a computation and more similar to a silent perception that's perpetually current. Alternative instruments interpret sound or remoteness into contact configurations, permitting the physical form sense information that never contact the visual structures or auditory structures. The essential constitutes consistency. When indications coordinate upward with occurrences in reality, the cerebrum acquires the designation and advances it to observation. This variety of sensory expansion discloses how adaptable maturity actually constitutes. We're communicated initially that development possesses an aperture that seals. Nevertheless, the mature cerebrum maintains reorganizing as extended, as contribution is constant and rehearsal is recurrent. Contemplation exploits that regulation by providing the mechanism a refined, elevated indication responsibility. Observe an objective, register deviations, restore. The recurrence is organized sufficient to refine circuitry without extensive disturbance. Over durations, the rehearsal can alter your standard stance toward the encounter. You transform the individual who registers initially and responds subsequently. That characteristic filaments through dialogue, labor, and rest. Identification frequently seems like an established assembly of characteristics: the manner you vocalize, the patience you possess, the varieties of cognitions that access underneath pressure. Neuroadaptive modification proposes a different perception. Acquire a novel expression, and the sounds you can perceive and generate expand. Initiate an everyday appreciation notation and networks that monitor interpersonal. Indicators in favorable particularity illuminate more promptly. Shift your workspace adjacent an aperture, and your concentration configurations modify to the different illumination and disturbance. The self that manifests across periods constitutes less a formation and more a collection of rehearsed trajectories. You conceptualize the manner you've rehearsed. You sense along the trajectories you've reinforced. This doesn't signify you can transform anything instantaneously. The cerebrum exchanges velocity for precision initially on. Novel patterns seem uncomfortable and decelerated because the mechanism continues corresponding. That phase constitutes a characteristic. It necessitates concentration to remain intimate to the mechanism. As automation constructs, the encounter refines. Contemplation employs this progression deliberately. Initially, you expend the majority of your periods, detecting the consciousness wandering. That constitutes the labor. Over duration, the consciousness wanders reduced distant and returns more rapidly. The improvement constitutes in the recuperation channel, not in never obtaining interrupted. That restructure independently can preserve individuals rehearsing sufficiently extended for the connection to modify. There exists also a configurational aspect to the advantages that tends to be overlooked: stance, respiration mechanics, and interoception. When you position vertical with the thoracic enclosure liberated, the respiratory mechanism possesses space to shift. That motion supplies indications from the physical form backward to the cerebrum about protection and constancy. Decelerated. Constant respiration transmits a projectable pattern through the nervous mechanism. Those indications transform component of the tranquility you sense. In contemplation, you utilize them deliberately. You're not opposing the physical form to tranquil the consciousness. You're recruiting the physical form to communicate the consciousness that it can establish. That partnership generates the cognitive calibration at here. As rehearsal intensifies, concentration doesn't exclusively establish, it expands. You commence to register micro-selections before they solidify into conduct. A disapproving expression initiating, an appendage elevating, a cognition establishing that would have rotated into a remark 10 moments subsequently. That initial identification generates space to modify. Modifications recurrent frequently transform tendencies. Tendencies rehearsed sufficiently extended commence to seem like disposition. At that phase, exterior pressures don't vanish. However, they establish on a plane that absorbs disruption more productively. The identical occurrences produce reduced remainder. Rest is more refined. Recuperation is more rapid. The adaptability that absorbs novel perceptions also absorbs novel cognitive patterns. If you initiate and conclude your period examining for one minor matter you acquired, you calibrate the cerebrum to catalog advantages. That pattern reinforces an acquisition orientation, which modifies how you encounter difficulty. Difficult matters transform indicators to attract rather than indications to withdraw. Over a duration, this alteration modifies which recollections your consciousness categorizes as significant. It initiates accumulating verification and exertion operates. That repository subsequently affects your anticipations, which influence your selections. Selections recurrent transform the novel standard for the trajectories that define you. Technology supplements another stratum by generating theoretical indications substantial. A transportable apparatus that resonates gently when your concentration advances can complete the response channel in actual duration. Instruments that convert environmental information into contact can extend recognition into areas you couldn't perceive before. The instruction doesn't represent that apparatuses generate you improved. It constitutes that the cerebrum will acquire whatever constitutes uniform and beneficial. Contemplation constitutes the diminished technology version of the identical principle. You provide yourself a constant indication and an elementary regulation. The mechanism acquires. If character constitutes a collection of rehearsed projections and responses, subsequently, contemplation constitutes a manner to modify the rehearsal schedule. Position for several periods, and you calibrate registering. Transport that into a dialogue, and you calibrate attending. Transport it into pressure, and you calibrate recuperation. Accumulate these minor occasions, and the identification that seems like you alters. You may continue acknowledging your preferences and peculiarities, however the manner they manifest modifies. You transform someone who can pause somewhat more extended before functioning, someone who can sense agitation without supplying it. The most optimistic component constitutes that purpose holds significance more than intensity. You don't require durations in silence to modify the cerebrum. You require a uniform indicator, a considerate attitude toward transferring concentration, and a preparedness to commence repeatedly. Commence repeatedly transforms the capacity. It traverses adequately. It encounters you in movement, in assemblies, at restoration. It constitutes the identical motion every occasion register, return, continue. Each channel abandons an indication. Indications accumulate into trajectories. Trajectories welcome you backward until ambulating them seems natural. Therefore, when you select to seal your visual structures and ensue the emergence and descent of your respiration, you're not exclusively pursuing tranquility, you're composing the patterns that will. Acknowledge your subsequent difficulty. The consciousness you encounter the following morning will have been molded by what you rehearsed this night. And that expands a silent inquiry that pauses precisely underneath the tranquility you're acquiring to generate. You position silently and subsequently register something subtle connect into position. The elementary reality that you're here registering. A respiration emerges and descends. Cognitions transfer through not on instruction, however, on their personal schedule similar to elements that manifest and diminish in a space with no surfaces. The recognition that registers those cognitions rotates interior for an instant and identifies exclusively additional registering. There doesn't manifest a substantial item designated me in that instant exclusively, this accessible range where perceptions, recollections, and minor impulses materialize and advance. It can seem tranquil or moderately peculiar, similar to observing into a reflection and observing the complete space behind you, however not the reflection itself. Researchers correspond operation when you compensate concentration, recollect a designation, shift an appendage, or sense a cardiac beat impact at your thorax. They can direct to networks that manage sound, sight, arrangement, and self-directed vocalization. They can even observe resting networks inactive into mechanism when your consciousness wanders. Nevertheless, the elementary activation of constituting alert advances through the network. You can monitor trajectories and continue malfunction to identify the observer. Advance more profoundly. Where constitutes the coordinate that encounter transforms the sensation of I constitute encountering. It's similar to positioning on a foundation, and attempting to advance behind the illumination that generates the foundation perceptible. Each phase exclusively illuminates another segment of playing. Recognition maintains constituting the matter, executing the observing. One manner to comprehend this constitutes to address recognition as a narrator, not a documentation apparatus. The cerebrum doesn't pause for reality to materialize and subsequently respond. It projects the subsequent instant and organizes an optimal estimation about what you'll observe, perceive, and sense. Sensory contribution examines those anticipations, influencing them into coordination. This mechanism operates rapidly. Therefore, what you designate presently already transports the impression of a projection molded by disposition, recollection, and situation. The outcome seems like direct contact with actuality. However, it constitutes a narrative that establishes ahead of the final information and subsequently refreshes if required. The majority of duration, the estimation establishes sufficiently intimate that it seems continuous. When it overlooks, you register the disruption, the peculiar language you conceptualized you perceived, the phase you nearly overlooked, the countenance you incorrectly interpreted before your cerebrum amended. That identical mechanism weaves your preferences, opinions, and boundaries into a perception of self. You recollect how you managed a tense assembly, how you functioned with a companion, how you responded to a minor malfunction. Those instants transform unprocessed substances for an operating narrative about who you constitute. Your neural trajectories modify with each encounter, reinforcing patterns you recur and releasing alternatives you disregard. Interpersonal response supplies into this channel approval, uncertainty, comfort, remoteness. The individual attending presently doesn't represent the individual you were a year previously, and not the individual you'll constitute subsequent year. Nevertheless, your narrative weaves the modifications into a singular filament. This continuity seems constant even as the substance modifies. The manner a waterway preserves its designation, while its liquid never remains the identical. There manifests a silent examination you can operate. Reflective a characteristic you believe you possess: patient, rapid to express amusement, protected, courageous. Inquire where you acquired that. Frequently, it monitors to a collection of vivid instants that established out, while thousands of alternative instants advanced by unmarked. What your consciousness preserved, it employed to define you. What it permitted advance of never connected the narrative. In this manner, identification can oscillate on which recollections seemed value, preserving, and which projections about yourself the consciousness maintained verifying. Modify the encounters you sample, and the projections alter. Modify the situation you exist in, and the narrative assumes a novel configuration without declaring that it has. Modified conditions generate the framework more comfortable to observe. With constant concentration on the respiration or a secure coordinate in the physical form, cognitive discussion can silence. The perception of constituting a separate observer occasionally releases not from conviction, however from direct encounter. There continues manifesting observation, however the boundary that arranges me for not me refines. A similar expansion can transpire during wonder, positioning underneath a transparent nocturnal atmosphere, or attending to a sound that appears more substantial than the space. For several instants, recognition expands beyond pattern. The recognizable vocalization that narrates your existence shifts to the surroundings. It doesn't represent that you vanish. It constitutes that the typical peripheries seem less established. When the instant transitions, the peripheries return. However, something in you recollects that they can shift. That adaptability holds significance because it demonstrates that awareness can reorganize its personal priorities. The consciousness can alter which indications it magnifies and which narratives it prefers. Provided duration and rehearsal, that alteration abandons indications in cerebral surface and in conduct. The manner you concentrate modifies. Your perception of danger or protection modifies. Your capacity for pause modifies. The silent observer you registered at the initiation maintains observing. However, the substance it observes develops less intertwined, or at minimum more transparent. You initiate to detect a cognition precisely as it establishes and observe the projection concealing interior it. You register a feeling as it colors observation and sense the hue extract when the feeling transitions. Each of those instants constitutes compact. However, collectively, they supplement upward to a novel standard for how encounter is assembled. Individuals occasionally inquire whether this generates liberated selection and false perception. If recognition constitutes downstream from innumerable concealed mechanisms, what space is abandoned for selection? One response constitutes functional. The sensation of selecting concentrates conduct toward objectives, promotes contemplation, and molds how we maintain ourselves and one another responsible. Even if the origin of selection is intricate, the encounter of selecting continues steering motion. Another response constitutes experiential. When you compensate intimate concentration, you can observe purposes emerge, disagree, and establish. Certain purposes seem powerful and persistent. Alternatives diminish. You can affect which ones obtain intensity by modifying what you supply your consciousness and where you position concentration. The area may constitute compact, nevertheless, it manifests and you can operate within it. Attend to the character of your interior narrator for an instant. Is it considerate, urgent, amused, impartial? That character frequently projects how the subsequent several durations will seem. If the narrator anticipates disagreement, you may examine for it and identify it. If it anticipates comfort, you register what operates and permit minor deviations advance. This doesn't represent a technique of favorable cognition. It constitutes the consciousness's projection mechanism executing its responsibility. Anticipations flex observation, which subsequently returns as verification for the anticipation. Disrupt the channel with a different contribution, more decelerated respiration, a modification of moment, an inquiry inquired in a gentle manner, and the channel recalibrates over duration. These minor rotations transform the novel standard. The perception of self you transport also assists as an instrument. It assists you traverse interpersonal existence, recollect obligations, and preserve commitments across duration. However, it continues constituting an assembly that refreshes as situations modify. You can employ that to your benefit by providing your consciousness novel substance. Acquire a capacity, and the self that couldn't execute transforms the self that can. Expend duration with individuals who maintain an improved version of you in consciousness, and your interior narrator initiates to vocalize with their confidence. Permit yourself rest, and the exhausted self misplaces its hold on the instrument. None of this necessitates substantial declarations. It constitutes about the constant transfer of projections toward configurations that reinforce the individual you're transforming. A final contradiction positions at the center of everything. Awareness seems like the most individual intimate matter you possess, and nevertheless, it doesn't manifest as a singular substantial item you can identify. It operates more similar to a coordination mechanism, coordinating numerous mechanisms so they deliver as one. On the plane, that one seems elementary. Underneath, it constitutes an accumulation of indications negotiating every instant. When the accumulation is adequately calibrated, you advance through your period and designate it commonplace. When it malfunctions, you designate it a malfunction. Both conditions disclose the identical underlying infrastructure. Therefore, you return to that initial compact connection of registering. There manifests encounter transpiring, and there manifests the perception that it is transpiring to someone. Whether that someone constitutes established or adaptable, whether selection constitutes an activation or an expansion, the instant is here. You can permit the narrative maintain executing its labor and continue rest in the component that observes without supplementing supplementary disturbance. From there, even commonplace moments seem somewhat broader, as though recognition had silently modified the concentration and attracted additional of reality into